Hello, you found the portal. I'm your host, Eric Weinstein, and we're here today with my good friend, Sam Harris. Sam, thanks for coming by.
Thank you. It was great.
So, first question, are you in any trouble that I don't know about?
I don't think so. I think you know what trouble I get into as I get into it.
Okay.
So I often look to you for...
Well, occasionally I get a call from you and you say, I'm thinking about getting into the following form of trouble to talk me out of it. I try, and if it happens that I'm not there for an hour and a half, I get another call saying, too late.
Yeah. I remember one that a vacation that was unraveling, and I was calling you from literally from poolside
in Hawaii.
The one vacation I had taken with my family in a year, and I was poised to ruin it, and ruin it I did, and I don't blame you for it, but whatever counsel you gave me did not prevent the unraveling of a vacation.
Well, I'm here to afford you the opportunity to ruin a future vacation, but let's try to avoid it if we can.
Okay.
I'm just curious. First of all, I've taken your advice and Tim Ferriss's and Joe Rogan's and started this podcast. You were actually the first person I sat down with, but I had so little idea what I was doing that we blocked out the windows. We had an uncomfortable table in front, and the feng shui was completely off.
We had an Addams Family podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're trying things. I'm learning a little bit. But first of all, anytime you want to flip the tables on me, I'm game too. What is top of mind for you at the moment, or should I can go into some topics that I'm curious?
Go wherever you want to go. This is your show.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm starting to think about is doing a little bit of retrospective work, trying to think about where our world, our country is. We're going into another electoral cycle, and I just think this is the most bizarre age imaginable. It doesn't behave like any previous time. And I hear that we're at peak this and peak that, but I don't see any signs of what I increasingly see is the incoherence slowing down. Are you also perceiving a world that is kind of intellectually unraveling, or are you seeing new kinds of formations that give you the idea that something is actually filling the voids that have been opening up when it comes to coherence?
Well, I worry that this is a kind of cognitive delusion, that to think that the time you're in is always sort of newly chaotic or incoherent, or that civilization's on the brink in some new way in your time. But I'm taken in by it.
You've got to be kidding, man.
Yeah.
This has never happened.
Yeah. No. I mean, this is but there's got to be some name for this, where it's just, it's some kind of recency effect, or I mean, clearly there have been periods in history where things really have been on the brink in some new way.
Oh, I don't mean to suggest that like this is in general.
No, I don't mean like World War II is about to happen. World War III is about to happen, but I do feel like we are witnessing several sea changes, which I couldn't have honestly said that 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I mean, something has changed, and some things have clearly changed for the worse. And maybe there's a silver lining to this chaos, but I would be hard pressed to find it at the moment.
Well, so when I'm starting to think about what kind of chaos we're in, and using the fact that you and I agree on a lot, which I think makes our disagreements more interesting, because I don't like the ground level he said, she said kinds of disagreements. I don't think they're that interesting. For me, the big thing that's really new is that I can't think of a single institution I trust. There's no place that I can go to for ground truth.
Like, this is an example. So you take the New York Times, and you and I whinge about the New York Times a fair amount.
I've been watching you transition.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've grown pretty dark about the paper
That's
record.
New.
Yeah.
Like 5 years ago, you were somewhere else.
Yeah, but I guess I'm wondering whether the cohort before us 20 years ago had this same litany of complaints about the New York Times, or whether something fundamentally has shifted.
Well, I've been on the New York Times since the 80s.
Okay, so you were early to this party.
Yeah, I was very early to this party.
But something has changed. So is this worse than the 80s?
It's a good question. Depends. Worse isn't the right word, in my opinion. The way I would play with it is, I'd say that its problem has always been the same, which is narrative-driven journalism. And The first clear indication I have of this, I think, was a story about Woodstock, in which the paper told the reporter.
How old are you? You're not that much older than me. I was still in my diapers.
No. I don't remember this as a 3-year-old.
Woodstock is 69?
Yeah. Okay, no, it's not that. I remember reading. I will clarify. I remember reading a story about the journalist who was sent to cover Woodstock by the Times, being told, write about the filth and the hippies and the unkemptness. And
strangely, that's a bias that I now share. I at one point I had there was a point in my life in my 20s where I kind of recapitulated the 60s for myself, and had nothing but nostalgia for the 60s that I missed. But now I have a fairly Joan Didion look at the slouching toward Bethlehem moment that was just the level of dysfunction and the non-acknowledgement of dysfunction. It was pretty shocking. So,
but I'm not really tempting to follow that thread, but I'm not going to. Gambit declined.
Okay.
What I recall of the story is that the Times had told the reporter what sort of story to file, and the reporter called up the Times and said, I refuse. I'm seeing something different. I'm seeing something inspiring and heart-opening, and I'm not going to file that story. So if that's what you want, it's not going to.
And I have cholera.
And I have cholera. So I think that the narrative aspect of the New York Times has been both its structural reason for its importance and the fatal flaw that, in essence, it carries these very long narrative arcs that come from the editorial function at the Times, and that those are written in some sense before the facts are known. And so the facts are then fit to the narratives, and then when the counter narratives occur, the Times really either doesn't report the story, as in they really couldn't handle the situation that happened with my brother because it was exactly counter narrative, or then they distort based on the idea that they need to push things back into the narrative. So I think that has always been present. And there are particular kinds of stories that the Times writes that I find absolutely, I'll go so far as to say borderline evil. And what they do is they crowd out whatever natural inquiry process would be happening. So I'm happy to get into a couple of examples about that. But I would say I think that the problem has been there at the New York Times all along. There are some new things that I see as happening there, like a conflict between the old line journalists with the new line of sort of, Brooklyn-based writers who are telling us how to think. Yeah. What do you make of it?
I don't know if the Times may be an exception here, but I think generally what's happened in journalism is there's just been a clearing out of real journalists, right? I mean, the business has gotten so bad. And again, the Times and the Post and the Atlantic, there's a few outliers here that are doing well in the age of Trump, at least, sort of well.
Trump is saving their business models.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they weren't doing great before Trump, but now they're doing okay. But the rest of journalism has been gutted. And now we basically have the blogosphere. And, it's kind of what the Huffington Post did to the landscape, where you just have a lot of people blogging for free, propping up an ad-based clickbait business model.
Sure.
And,
but again, I guess what I want to play with is there something special about institutions? Imagine that you can get all of the interesting articles that you like somewhere, and somebody's saying something interesting, you can piece them together. But the fact that there's no institutional home where you can trust that, like, the Office of Management and Budget or something, or.
But in some, what I'm saying about journalism in general is that what you think of as the institution, I mean, just like the veneer, the front-facing website, is not even an institution in many cases. It's like it's hard to differentiate what is a blog and what is an actual journalistic resource that has editors and fact checkers and copy editors. And for certain sites, the distinction is apparently non-existent. I mean, so like, people used to think Salon was real journalism, or the Guardian. I mean, the Guardian has like a kind of the blog side and the Guardian side. You can't tell the difference. You're just reading what somebody wrote, and
you find the same people on Twitter. Who are
and then everyone is nuts on Twitter, whatever their reputation really is, or should have been.
Well, but you could just see their bias. Like they're not hiding it on Twitter, and then they hide it when they're in their journalistic frame.
Although I would argue that I'm fairly forgiving on that point, because I feel that Trump has made the hiding of one's so-called bias irresponsible. Essentially, it's like you can't pretend that this is a normal president doing normal things, and you're going to be a normal journalist without an opinion.
Well, I agree with that. Although I would say you and I are very split on this. So to put a placeholder, maybe we'll get back to it, maybe not. That I'm more worried about the loss of things like Nature and Science than I am the New York Times. I'm now worried that there is nothing, even in the hard sciences almost, that can stand up to the onslaught of political pressure creeping into everything that has to be able to say no. That we've lost the ability to tell people to screw off if they're wrong.
Well, it's certainly been creeping up on us in the life sciences. It's been true of the social sciences for a very long time.
Yeah, it probably, physics and math are going to be the last to go, but I've even seen a little bit of inroads there. And so I find the loss of Nature and Cell in the universities terrifying. Differently from the New York Times. Like this is a few layers deeper and more dangerous. Do you not perceive that?
Oh, I think there's just different problems. I don't know which is more consequential. I mean, I think the failure to have a fact-based discussion and the incentives to avoid one. I think that's just the scariest thing we have going, apart from the true monsters of pandemic and nuclear war and things like that.
Well, those are now increasingly relative with the vaxxer anti-vaxxer controversy. But there's the self-refereeing. Like one of the things that's really important to have a decent discussion, in my opinion, is that you have to agree on what a discussion is and what constitutes an illegal move. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, I feel like we're having these combat sports where we can't agree on what rules, like is biting an ear part of boxing? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Who's to say? Well, that's an imposition of your views on mine. Who can still self-adjudicate?
Well, I think if you wait long enough, you see the failures of hypocrisy, right? I mean, you see people try to enshrine a new set of rules that prove unworkable in some of the context, or they just can't live up to them because of it's impossible. I mean, we're now noticing, and it's been widely observed, that more or less, if you wait around long enough, everyone's going to get canceled. It's like the repurposing of the Warhol quote. We'll all be canceled for 15 minutes at some point.
It's not going to be 15 minutes.
And it's so we just before we started this podcast, we were joking that Justin Trudeau has yet another blackface photo of himself apparently appearing online, and here's one of the most woke and sanctimonious enforcers of this new norm of just political correctness, stretching to infinity, and he's got not only blackface in his past, but apparently a positive passion for blackface.
It's a recurrent issue.
Yeah, so it's. I mean, the hypocrisy is so delicious, but it's just the. These new norms of not being honest about facts just can't scale. I mean, people will be tripped up by them, and it's not to say we can't do a lot of harm to ourselves in the meantime or in certain areas.
Well, I think we're trying to do harm to ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that the idea, sometimes I think about Trump as the doctor who has to break a bone that has been misset in the hopes that it can finally heal properly. And this is one of the places where you and I
Except
are
he's a
like,
doctor who doesn't know which bone he has in hand and isn't actually intending to heal you. So
well,
it's,
and
just
he's
it's the happy accident of the doctor the madman who happens to have a hold of the right femur and is breaking it for the wrong reasons, but to good effect.
right, or is a doctorate in folklore and from some non-accredited university.
Yeah.
So
Sorry to keep segueing on you, but I know you have a passion for India. I remember once traveling in India and seeing somebody's, a doctor's, it was actually a dentist's shingle, and it was Western trained dentist, and in parentheses, failed. But having just made the attempt was enough to put that on the shingle.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, that does sound good. So I think you get Trump wrong.
Right.
And it's not, I see what you see. And it's maddening. It's driving me crazy. The idea of spending 4 more precious years of my dwindling life talking about whatever Trump last said or tweeted, or worried that I don't know what would happen if we actually had a 5-alarm fire in the U.S. that had to be handled.
Do you think my model of his mind is wrong, or my model of the consequences of him being in office is wrong?
Well, I think that you were slow to give him his due. I mean, of course, as you know, I wrote this essay on kayfabe,
right?
Anticipating that professional wrestling was going to turn out to be incredibly important. And in fact, I thought it was going to determine the presidency. That was a belief I had, that understanding how lies play within the mind and how hypocrisy works, and a concept called namespaces out of Python programming and the like, how we compartmentalize, led me to believe that in essence, I'd seen these other candidacies in other countries in which people seem not to be able to distinguish an actor from the character that they played, and whatnot. And so I believed that the system of lies within professional wrestling told us what was possible. And Trump actually sort of came out of the WWE through his association with the McMahon family. Yeah. And I believe that he actually understood deep things that psychology departments will wake up to 20 years from now.
I guess I've suggested by analogy to the Chauncey Gardiner effect, or the evil Chauncey Gardiner effect.
Well, but
that's wrong.
I think,
but it's hard to know. That could happen. I mean, it's definitely falsifiable. My theory is falsifiable. He could prove to me with a string of utterances that he's the evil genius that I haven't imagined him to be. But he hasn't done that.
If you and I had a couple of old fashions between us, and we sat down with 1,000 of his tweets, we could figure out that there were recurrent structures, and we could write an ELIZA program to generate them to tangle Democrats. I think that there's much more method to the madness, and I don't have to go full Scott Adams. Scott, I know you're out there somewhere. Yeah. To say that everything is intentional and brilliant. I just think he's got it was for years I said that if you wanted to win an election against a Democrat, you just would talk about the nuclear family, let them correct you to nuclear, right, and then you'd win because you come across as an ass. Yeah, right, yeah. Exactly. So I think that there is a certain amount of method that you were slow to give him credit for, but I think you're probably inching towards the idea that if he's not an evil genius, he has some evil genius.
I think it's just, again, I'm enamored of my Chauncey Gardiner analogy.
All right.
Well, here's another analogy that is even simpler and more easier to confirm. It's clear there's a method, but I think it's just a very simple method that the power of which is an accident of the context. So it's like an Instagram model has a method, right? If you have a great body, show it to great effect on your Instagram channel, and then wait around for people to follow you, right? So it's a very simple formula. There's no question it works. There's not a lot of method to it.
But even the rallies that he likes, the rallies are a feedback mechanism.
Right.
So he knows that the feedback that he's getting from the press in general has a constant distortion. And so by holding a rally, he can figure out to some extent, it's like constant A/B testing.
But it doesn't have the fact that he wasn't canceled for one of his sins?
He was.
No, but the fact that there are enough people to insulate, he has enough fans of this style of communication and living that he's uncancelable, right? The fact that we have 40%.
No, he's canceled.
No, but we have 40% of the American population that fundamentally does not care about any of the things I care about in him.
I disagree with this, Sam. I think you're getting this wrong. This is what I think might be interesting.
Okay.
And I'm happy to be.
Okay.
I'm happy to be wrong too.
So you think they? So at what point?
I think that we're still in the stage of being so angry at Bill Clintonism.
Yeah.
That we just want to know you're not owned. We want something that convinces us that it's not taking orders.
But we're completely insouciant on the point of you potentially being owned by the Russians when that begins to get leaked.
Believe me, I think about this. I don't know. I haven't followed all the details. It's possible he's compromised and under direct control.
Well, let's just bracket that. Let's say we don't know. But when that begins to become a story and a credible story, zero interest from the people who are worried about him being owned by the usual suspect.
See, you don't carry the same anger and passion that I do for getting rid of the rot that was the American center. In other words, I believe one of the things I find very confusing is that you and I think, would normally have been called centrists.
Right.
But we're not kleptocentrists. I mean, I've never been in a position to loot the treasury from the position of being a centrist.
Right.
So the interesting thing about the center is that the center produces the blank canvas of America on which we get to paint. So I'm not really super excited to get a politician that makes me swoon. I want somebody to just gesso a canvas so that we can build all of the companies and nonprofits and do all the beautiful work that makes this country amazing. I'm not trying to get my entertainment from government. The thing that crept in to our system with Reagan and Bush giving way to the Clintons, back to Bush, and then bizarrely, I thought Obama was going to be a break from this. That thing induces a passion in some of us to get rid of it. We hate it. And I don't know that you carry that passion. And so I think it's harder for you to understand it. And I carry it not from a right-wing perspective. I carry it from a progressive to center-left position.
Well, and some of this comes back to the hypocrisy point I was making before. So I have that Trumpian module in my brain that feels just the pure schadenfreude of seeing Justin Trudeau get hoisted on his own petard, right? So he here's this sanctimonious enforcer of woke culture, just pandering to the left. It's clearly unsustainable. It's clearly dishonest. And unworkable. And we offline we spoke about just that moment where he's admonishing this elementary school age girl when she says the word mankind, which is it's great to hear a sixth grader use the word mankind, but he says no, we say people kind. Maybe they say people kind up in Canada. I haven't heard that, but even just saying humankind there and enforcing that taboo there was that's the elitism, the goofy elitism that
yeah, but it's not the elitism. It's the fact that these people have been picking our pockets and they've been divorcing us from each other.
I'm just saying I get let's just watch these fuckers burn stream of pleasure that you can get coursing in your brain.
Right. And
that explains a lot of the Trump phenomenon, where it's just on some level they don't care that he's the most odious liar we've ever seen, they being his fan base. They just love to see him wind up the libtards, right? They love to see
not
him
the libtards. Sam, I'm really trying to get at something. I may be wrong, so forgive me if I'm going off on a tangent. But I really think that there was something much more evil. It wasn't just that these people were sneering at us over crudité. It's like It's that they were picking our pockets. They were divorcing us from each other. They came up with a bullshit ideology, if you will, of the Davos flavor that said, we are the world, and divorced us from each other in terms of our obligations to fellow countrymen above our obligations to people who, live abroad. When that was really a cover for figuring out how to make money when we were largely, in many ways, stagnant. And so you had a class of people who probably blew out the Gini coefficient for the U.S. without getting to the real issues of the fact that we're a country, that we put people in uniform and send them into harm's way, that we have a higher duty and care in most of our minds to each other than we do to equally deserving people overseas.
But for the most part, the left was the political party that everyone was part of that same extractive economy, but the left at least paid lip service to the virtue of spreading the wealth around.
Well, there's this poem by Lewis Carroll about the walrus and the carpenter in one of the Alice sagas. And they're both going to trick a bunch of oysters into following them and then eating the oysters. And one of them is quite clear about his desire to eat oysters. And the other one makes a big show of how sad it is that they played a little trick and all of them were eaten. And the key question is, which of these two figures is more reprehensible? And I always disliked the one who was terribly sad about what they'd done. And I think that's the left.
Yeah, there's something to that. But I think there's also the all too common phenomenon of people motivated by actually good intentions, even incredibly noble intentions, causing a lot of chaos that they didn't intend. Right. So
is that your model for what was going on?
Well, it's my model for part of it. So take someone like, we take Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. Right. Well, I don't know Mark. I don't know how mercenary he's been from the beginning, and how out of touch with the possible harms he might cause he's been. But I can well imagine that here's somebody who could honestly say, connecting people is an intrinsic good. I'm just going to do that better than anybody, and the wealth will come, and this is all good for everybody, right? And then only at the 11th hour, long after many of us have noticed a problem, he begins to play catch up with the problem. That's a fairly charitable view of what he was up to. Or the Google guys, don't be evil. Like I don't think when they said don't be evil, they were, twirling their mustaches and winking at each other, knowing all the while they were going to create a juggernaut of instability and also get fantastically wealthy and anchored to an extractive and ultimately unethical new kind of surveillance economy that we're going to be hard pressed to change. I don't think. At what point did they grade into having consciously bad intentions or intentions that were so mercenary as to be unethical? But a pure case of this, for me, falls in another sector, not economy, but foreign policy. You look at somebody like Samantha Power, right? Who wrote this famous book on genocide, A Problem from Hell. She drew lessons from our failure to intervene in a place like Rwanda, right? That we were morally culpable in some basic sense for not having intervened, right? We could have stopped the bloodshed. We didn't. And we even had, Navy SEAL teams. I mean, Jocko was just on this podcast. Jocko, I think, was offshore,
right.
At the time. We'd drawn the lesson from Somalia, seeing our, the Black Hawk Down incident, seeing our soldiers dragged through the streets, that we just can't get involved. And what happens when you're the one superpower and you decide you can't get involved? Well, then people, butcher their neighbors, and there's no way to stop them. So I think with the best of intentions, she and many others drew the lesson that we really do have to be the world's cop on some level, and we have to get involved, and we're morally culpable for not stopping a rape in progress or a murder in progress, and But now we're on the other side of that, U-shaped horror curve where we now know what it's like to get involved with however mixed intentions, and it's a thankless job, right? Like nation building is not a job that we're going to want for a long time, and for good reason.
Well, I actually have some weird backstory on that one.
Uh-huh.
So I knew Samantha Power at the Kennedy School, and she and I sat down. I mean, not well. I think we sat down at a meal. We had friends that connected us.
Right.
And I asked, what are you interested in? And she said, well, I'm obsessed with the Red Sox and genocide.
Yeah.
I said, what?
That's a good icebreaker. Yeah.
And she said, well, the rap on me is I'm all genocide all the time, but nobody cares. And I've got this book and I can't figure out the answer to the question, why is there not a resolution that why is never again not a resolution? And every time I try to get a state to sign up for this or somebody to take this seriously, there's this weird wall that comes down. It's the clearest thing in the world that we should never let genocide ever happen again.
Right.
And she was convinced that nobody was going to take her seriously. This was going to go nowhere. And then progressively, somehow this thing started to catch fire. And for a period of time, I was emailing her like, do you believe it now? Do you believe it now? Because I knew this thing was going to get huge. I also knew that it wasn't going to work because it comes from this beautiful place that is not really deeply beautiful. I mean, it's sort of meretricious. It's appealing, but it doesn't understand what the forces are that create genocide because very few people want to go that deep on that question. And in that case, I saw a human being who I can just vouch for. This was the purest of intentions early on. And then as the complexities started to reveal themselves, she became enmeshed in a very difficult series of trolley problems or trolley-like problems.
Right.
I believe that partially happens in places like Facebook and Google, but very often, I think it's your theory of mind that I'm going to take issue with, which is that I don't think people are as unified in their thinking. They very often have a mercenary part of their brain and a beautiful part of their brain, and they have a partition that keeps those from talking to each other. And one of the ways in which I found this out was when a group of people, doctors actually, in New York City wanted to sort of use me as a consultant for my mathematical and analytic mind. And we went out for a very fancy dinner. And I said, what's the topic? And they said, reconceptualizing medical debt. I knew nothing about this. And essentially what they told me is that if you go to an emergency room and you agree to have all sorts of things done, you don't feel like paying exorbitant inflated bills later because you feel like that was an emergency. I had no ability to actually think this through.
Couldn't shop around, yeah.
Exactly. And this is extortionary. But if you give somebody the ability to say, okay, what if you pay us 82 cents on the dollar and we'll let 18 cents go, then suddenly the performance of that debt skyrockets.
Mm-hmm.
And a phrase came out, which was when they talked about reconceptualization, they said, it's a beautiful thing. And I realized that I had heard that phrase in New York whenever people are up to no good. It's a beautiful thing. Well, it's a beautiful thing. It's just, and so I then put out this thing in my group, which is, did you notice that when people in New York do bad things to other people, they always say it's a beautiful thing? And sure enough, it caught in people's minds. So whenever anybody started to say it, they realized, oh my gosh, I'm in a part of my mind that recognizes that I can transfer wealth from somebody else to me, largely without the other person knowing it, in a way that results in benefit for me and some harm that's been externalized. I think that people both know that they're doing tremendous harm and carry the idealism that propels it. And it's the combination of these things and the fact that they don't talk to each other.
Yeah, well, I think you're not going to get me to disagree there, that people are impressively split, or at least can be. And I think coherence, generally speaking, or at least striving for it, is good. I mean, I think living an examined life, in part, is struggling with those discoveries of incoherence and figuring out how to get this congress of minds that you call yourself to actually cohere.
But you're getting them to cohere.
Yeah, no. But when you're talking about the normal person, who I think it is a frequent phenomenon to have, normal the normal range of good intentions, to not be a sociopath, to want to help the world, to be in philanthropy, for instance, right? To actually to be this. I mean, if you're devoting your life, if you're a smart person who got a good degree, who could work more or less anywhere, but you decide to work for a charity, right? You're already an outlier. You're already somebody who said no to Wall Street or no to Hollywood or no to something, and now you're working for the Southern Poverty Law Center or something. Like, you want to just stop racism, right? So you're already one of the good guys, right? And this is an example dear to my heart that I flog at every opportunity. The Southern Poverty Law Center is, I think, was probably consciously started for the best of intentions, operated under the blindingly brilliant light of those intentions for a very long time, but something flipped. And one thing that flipped is that, and probably unbeknownst to everybody, there's a bad incentive problem here. I mean, the only way they survive as an organization is to continue to stay in this sort of long emergency mode of there are Nazis everywhere, right? Everyone, it's like, this is a problem. It's a 4-alarm fire. Give us money. We now have a budget of whatever it is, $30 million a year. I mean, it's got to be huge. The fundraising drive never stops. And so what happens to an organization like that when you begin to run out of Nazis? Well, then you have to find more, right? Like, the incentive is to never recognize that you've gotten a handle on the problem, right? It'd be like, in some, epidemiological space where, you're curing smallpox, but you could never admit that you've actually cured it. You have to pretend to find smallpox everywhere. Now, I'm not saying white supremacy or white power or anything has been cured, but what has happened is you have people who probably were true outliers in their ethical scrupulosity, who are now behaving in appalling ways, destroying people's reputations, calling them Nazis when they know they're not Nazis.
Well, let's put a finer point on it. They are now more likely to let the genie out of the bottle because of their bad behavior, or to huff and puff on an ember that is the pathetic Ku Klux Klan of 2019,
right,
to actually create something that could turn into a roaring fire. I mean, this is a general feature. I often talk about this in terms of magnetic and true north, where the angle of declination that separates them is very small at the equator, but in northern Canada, it's very large, right?
And at the pole, south is everywhere.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just, the problem is that the institution, I mean, look, I've made this point elsewhere, so regular listeners will have heard it, but the concept of the embedded growth obligation, the ego of an institution, which is it has to do work and grow in order to meet its mandates. That is the thing that has metastasized throughout our institutional structure. And so it's not the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, that's particularly egregious, but the entire university system, every single measure you can take on that thing looks like an intergenerational wealth transfer, right down to the non-dischargeability of student debt and bankruptcy, the loading up of every university by administrators, and the monopolization at the moment. Almost 100% of our leading institutions are run by a baby boomer, whereas the average age in a different era of a university president would have most of them under Gen X control and some of them under millennial control. There were university presidents in their 30s who had a huge impact. I mean, that is a system which has gone totally metastatic.
Yeah. Well, that may be an outlier. I mean, it's the way
it's the worst large system of its kind.
Yeah. I mean, the way costs have gone up there, way outpacing inflation.
Outpacing medical inflation.
Yeah. It's amazing. And the fact that you can't discharge your debt in bankruptcy.
It's perfect.
Yeah. And the fact that, many of our friends have spent a lot of time complaining about this, but the fact that you have whole fields that are essentially, sham fields, right, that are in the humanities where it's just pseudo-knowledge is being imparted to the next generation. And it's not only its own walled garden of pseudo-knowledge, it is a disparagement of real knowledge. Like the anti-science, moral panic that is happening in the humanities.
It is a fit mimetic complex.
Well, it's fit thus far. I mean, it's producing new graduates. Yeah.
Well, and it's colonizing things outside of itself.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the problem,
tech, yeah.
Journalism, tech, human resources, anything which is a high leverage, but often poorly paid for the level of intelligence usually required, or the amount of training usually required, becomes attractive. So there's a perverse incentive when you can't pay journalists or scientists or even technologists at appropriate levels. And I know people will scream and say, oh, you have no idea how much money tech people get paid. And I really don't believe it. I think that those jobs are supposed to be even better compensated because of large-scale tampering in the sector. What I believe is that we're looking at the difference between truth and fitness. And if you recall, when I first went on your program, I said I care about 4 things. Truth is one of them, but I also care about meaning, fitness, and grace. This is a great example where fitness is outcompeting truth.
But we have a hand in this. So we can tune the landscape, right? So this is
me?
Well,
sometimes I just feel it's like the two of us.
Yeah.
And that's why I call you, Sam, what the hell's going on?
Yes. A relatively small number of people can do it. It doesn't take 7 billion people or 8 billion people to do
Who do
this.
we got at the moment?
No, but like you need to convince the top, 3,000 people that one way of talking doesn't work, right? And to align fitness and truth more faithfully.
I'm not used to disagreeing with you this much, but
That's good. That's why I came here with my
good loaded
alter
prepare.
ego. Yeah.
Sam, I think we've screwed up a lot worse than you're imagining in the past, and that is the fodder for the twin evils of Trumpism and wokeism.
But just grant me the possible sea change effect of the 3,000 people, the right 3,000 people fundamentally getting their heads straight on these issues, or any issue, right? Whatever it is. So you're talking about basically all of Hollywood, all of journalism, and all of science that's public facing.
If
right?
we could do that.
Yeah.
Okay. In some thought experiment.
Yeah.
I guess what my feeling is, first of all, is that my head is so filled with malware. I'm running so many nonsensical programs put there by other people that I don't even know are nonsense, where I can detect.
Do you have a sense of what direction to point to where you're going to find the nonsense?
Well, so
what are you worried about? Yeah.
Well, so we're currently sitting in a room with reflective glass and anechoic tiles that deaden sound. If I echolocate by things that I am absolutely positive would sell newspapers that aren't printed, that it's like, okay, you're echolocating, and instead of hearing the reflection off of glass, you're hearing an absence, which is anechoic tile. And so if I just look at Google Trends, which tells me what people are searching on, if I look at how Google auto-completes, which tells me what they want me to see is what other people are searching on in the search bar,
right.
If I look at what stories aren't being run, all of the dead stuff is astounding to me right at the moment. Like, I know, for example, that people are fascinated by the Jeffrey Epstein story. And in general, like, we just had... Right. So normally I don't love talking about current events because it dates the program, but we just had Kevin Spacey's accuser reported as dying. I don't think that is likely to be part of some super evil plot. So just so people can calibrate, it's not that everything that could make sense, because there's an incentive I chalk up to a conspiracy. The Jeffrey Epstein thing is totally different. And you and I both met this guy. For 15 years, and he's the only person that I've been saying this with conviction about for 15 years. I had one meeting with him. I've said he's a construct. Somebody hired a person, probably named Jeffrey Epstein, to play a role, super genius, mega billionaire philanthropist. I wasn't buying any of it. I've never bought it. And I've talked to everybody in our sort of mutual network and I always used one word because I wanted to make a huge bet that when the time came, I would say he was a construct and that I would be revealed to be correct. And that everybody always asks, what do you mean by a construct?
Right.
Okay.
Do you need to, have you clarified that on your podcast before?
Probably not. I recorded an entire Jeffrey Epstein episode, which is just me soloing for an hour.
Right.
But I haven't released it because I'm terrified. And I've had one ambiguous dinner where somebody sort of quasi-threatened me and I wasn't entirely sure what they were saying. It was a little bit creepy.
Well, this is a strand of human complication that you're way more in touch with than I am. I don't deny that it exists, right? So like, I think there are real conspiracies and powerful people occasionally, do what powerful people are occasionally sociopaths, and then they do what you would expect, or conspire to do what you'd expect. So I don't have a strong feeling about
let's just take
the likelihood that Epstein had a facilitated suicide. I think the likelihood that he was murdered is low, but allowed to commit suicide, I don't have a strong.
I'm agnostic about that. Whether some people stepped away so that he could do the thing that he needed to do, whether there's some vanishing probability that he actually isn't dead, I don't know. Not interested.
I put that at very low. Yeah.
I put that at very low odds as well.
Yeah, but I'm a fan of this.
You put it at 0 odds, Sam?
Well, I wouldn't. I know enough about probability to put almost nothing at 0 odds.
It's a huge difference between those people who insist. When I hear somebody insist that probability be 0, I take it, and that person is smart.
But effectively 0. I mean, 0 in the sense that we don't have to worry about it.
I waste no time thinking about it at the moment.
Right.
But I'm happy to have my Bayesian priors tutored.
Right.
Okay.
So I just don't have I mean, as you know, I'm taken in or I utilize this homily that you shouldn't ascribe to malice what can be explained by incompetence or whatever the formulation is.
And I find that that's a interesting heuristic for somebody.
I think it's usually true, right? So like it works much of the time and then it fails, but it fails in a case where you get more information and then you update your,
that was exactly my point, that the Kevin Spacey thing, I would say, is in the realm of Newtonian mechanics.
Right.
And then the Jeff Epstein thing is like relativistic quantum field theory. Whatever your Newtonian laws are, we're not in Kansas anymore. Right.
But I had you put me in the same room with him, so I should probably clarify that. So I found myself.
We should both apologize that nothing happened.
Yeah, that's right. I found myself at a lunch with him at the TED conference and had no insight into him or what he was up to, apart from the fact that my sort of creep detector went off.
And it spiked like crazy.
Yeah, I mean, he was someone who I didn't want to spend any more time with because he had this sort of schlocky, rich guy.
But within normal?
Well, no. I mean, it's just, but like when you see I guess he was probably, close to 60 at this point, and, he's with a 21-year-old. It's like the optics of that are all. I mean, obviously there are many rich guys who do that, and there are certainly many people in Hollywood who do that, and that's just the way some people roll when they have the opportunity to roll that way. And okay, fine, but there was just I have a kind of a level of judgmentalism around that.
Right.
It's like at minimum that's an attractor on the landscape of well-being that is not all that interesting to me. And so when you see someone captivated by that, like this is like life is going great because I'm 60 and she's 20, right? Like that's the one variable that
he's talking about his Lamborghini all the time.
Exactly, yeah, right. Like, okay, you've bored me already. But I had no more insight into him than that. I mean, I maybe exchanged 3 sentences with him.
From one meeting, I've been talking about him for 15 years.
Right. Yeah, because this was like a 10-person lunch.
Okay.
And I had maybe 3 sentences exchanged with him.
So mine was at his house.
Right.
I'm ushered into a waiting room. He's got some super complicated electronic art. I get up, I look at it, And I say, wait, is that a camera inside the art? I first think I'm a genius for finding a camera inside it.
Yeah.
My next thought is I'm supposed to find the camera inside the art because the art is supposed to draw my attention and I'm supposed to see that I'm being recorded. I'm called out to a room in back with a huge, long, sort of exaggerated dining table with a giant American flag as its tablecloth so that any food or drink that is served on it may spill onto an American flag.
Right.
And I'm just in high alert, like, fuck you. Who are you?
Right.
And he comes in and he's got this attractive, again, over probably 22, 23-year-old woman. I think she's introduced as an heiress or something.
Right.
And he's bouncing her on his knee in order to get my attention. There's some other guy who says nothing during the meeting. I have no idea what he was doing there.
And I think one detail I'd like to add here in defense of the many people and the many scientists who were in this guy's orbit and who didn't know how unseemly his life actually was. Some of these young women who you'd meet in his company were not just bimbos or strippers, or some of these people were going to medical school, and these were like smart young women.
Well,
who were,
and
who were
adult.
benefiting.
No,
from their
this is an
association with
incredibly important distinction. I don't think that the news media has done a good job of teasing out. It's very attached to the idea of Pedophile Island and Lolita Express,
Right.
And that lazy sensationalist journalism is crowding something out, which is that in general, from what I understand, so I met him in 2000, I think 2004, maybe 2003, but before his Florida incarceration and charges. Most people that I knew who met him with young adult women. And so my theory is that he was constructed to be the sapiosexual Hugh Hefner.
Right.
And that they stupidly hired, probably, and I guess I don't know this, Humbert for the role. And that dichotomy explains at least a lot of the initial willingness of the science community to play with this person. That I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not particularly judgmental about consenting adults, even if it's probably ill-advised, to have a 50-year spread between two people. Right. If somebody's 20 and somebody's 80, and
it's a completely different thing. It's very easy to see that if you've seen this guy be sort of the womanizing schmuck.
Right.
Within the bounds of total legality, he's surrounded by 20-year-olds, and he's got a 40-year
and
difference
everybody's
in age.
party to the game, and something about money.
You would never suspect this other thing about him.
Right. Okay. So that is not a fair defense after the Florida situation. The Florida situation changes that structure.
You mean his prosecution, or the Miami Herald thing that came out a year ago?
No. The prosecution.
Right.
So a lot of people continued to talk to him, in part because, and I think this is something that hasn't been teased out, he was supporting an older style of science, which, this is again something that's going to be super complicated, was much more disagreeable. Now, the woke movement has seized on this as, well, that's the cowboy oppressive science of male assholes. But he was supporting a network of people who might not have been supported otherwise to somewhat break out of the mold. And because the U.S. government had stepped away from that work in large measure, in my opinion, people were so dependent on him that they were eager to look the other way. And there was also the hint, I think, that this wasn't really Jeffrey Epstein, that this was really something else funding them.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think the relative penury of science is a corrupting variable. I mean, the fact that we underfund science, and that it matters that when the rich guy comes into the room, right, to scientists because they're so starved for money, that's just corrupting.
Well, look, this is I've been on this. This is going to get us into the immigration question, which is that in the mid '80s under Reagan, the science complex, particularly the National Science Foundation under Eric Bloch, through the National Academy of Sciences and a subdivision called the Government and University Industry Research Roundtable, GUIRR, conspired to destroy the bargaining power of American scientists by flooding the market And what they did is they did an economic analysis with both supply and demand curves to say that the wages, which you can calculate when you have two intersecting curves, were going to go above six figures for new PhDs.
So and then, let's get a lot of Indians in here.
Well, it was four countries. It was China, India, Taiwan, and Korea. Mm-hmm. And China went from 0 to 60 and they were sending us nobody. And then I think there were like over 25% of all graduate students. And of course, graduate students aren't students, they're workers. So there's a cryptic labor economy inside of the universities. And what the university system figured out is that in order to get this work done, we'd have to have these misclassified students who do the work imported as foreign workers. And what we would do is we would take the economic analysis, which they secretly did in 1986, and they'd subtract off the demand curve. And they'd just do a supply analysis based on the demography of the baby boom going into the baby bust, which is our generation, Gen X. And that demographic alarm was sounded to get the Immigration Act of 1990 passed, which has like the H-1B as one of its most famous features. So that's a whole story about how the actual workings, I'm the guy who uncovered that. And I chased that all the way down to the person who wrote that secret study that was never released, never dated, never authored.
Right.
That thing was the stepping away of the federal government from its commitment through the Vannevar Bush Endless Frontier Agreement to fund the kick-ass blue sky research that this country has done better than anyone else.
But how is that distinguishable from what on its face seems to me to be a rational policy, which is why not try to attract the world's best and brightest and incentivize them to start their businesses here, settle here. Once you've gotten your PhD at Harvard, you've got a green card, and here's the Silicon Valley's over there. So what? When
you start speaking, I feel like I'm hearing the Stars and Stripes forever. I've got one hand over my heart, and the Statue of Liberty is in the background with Emma Lazarus's poem at the base.
Right.
Do you actually believe that?
No. My point is that strikes me as a good policy, even though that would create more competition for so-called Americans,
right? Because
we're now open for the world's business. But if you actually wanted to maximize, creativity and industry here, you would want to import Indians and Chinese and Taiwanese and Koreans.
Well, I mean, look, I've married the maximum number of brilliant women from the developing world who came here to do STEM that the law will allow.
Right.
So exactly. I'm absolutely guilty.
You got your wife, and then you want to close the border?
What? Yeah. Well, first of all, that's how country clubs work. Right. So the idea is that when you get through a country club, when you get into a country club, you don't instantly say, well, I don't understand. It would be immoral for me to close the country club. I mean, so it's a very weird thing for me that people who are very steeped in what you were just talking about, which is this interesting mimetic complex that got pushed out, don't tend to think critically about it. Of course, we want the best people in the world to come to the U.S. selfishly. I mean,
well, not everyone doesn't. I mean, the person who has to compete with the best coming from India and Taiwan and China, that person, let's say in software engineering, that person is now suddenly on a much more competitive playing field,
this is so what I was told about this.
But I'm not saying that it's not without cost to somebody. It's definitely costing somebody something.
Right. Like the bad people, the people who
No, not the bad people, but just it's like
I don't even know how to go into all of the things that are like really funny and wrong about this. Like one of which is, well, are you afraid to compete with somebody from India? Well, maybe I'm afraid to compete with 100 people from India. Like the issue is what is the price point?
You're competing on this podcast. You're competing with people from India. I mean, you're competing with there are 800,000 podcasts.
No.
You're competing with 799
because it's not a uniform because it's not a uniform product, Sam.
No, but it's still a landscape.
When you talked about software, right? Most of software is glorified for and while loops. Let's not you invoke a library, you code up a class.
You can outsource it. Yeah.
All right. Well, no, I'm just saying that most of what it is you're just writing code. Yeah. And it's got a kind of a mystique about it because a lot of people haven't done it and it's too symbolic, whatever.
Right. But it's plumbing.
It's plumbing.
Yeah.
And a lot of science is plumbing.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the stuff about the best is not very relevant. If you wanted to take the stuff that's really distinguished, like you've got Ramanujan coming from India, you've got, Ellis coming from South Africa, whoever it is that's really amazing, we have plenty of room for the tiny number of people who are absolutely non-homogeneous super contributors.
So you're just saying you want to set the bar higher.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying a lot of different things. One is that people in a country have rights, and they have asymmetric rights to their own labor market. That's a large part of what it means to be a citizen of a country. If I start to talk about your rights that are perhaps your most valuable economic possession, if you really think about it, the American worker's most valuable economic possession is asymmetric access to the American labor market. If I say, your right is not an asset, but is instead an impediment, it's a barrier. And what we need to do is get rid of the red tape. And I'm not going to pay you for it because it's not an asset. I'm going to take it from you. And I'm going to say that that's what the free market is. Well, that has nothing to do with the free market. I wrote a paper called Migration for the Benefit of All that pointed out you're free to securitize people's right and pay for it.
Right.
And then everybody wins.
Yeah.
That's not what we do.
Okay. So, but that's something we could do, though. We are not interested. Put an economic
that would be a Coasian
price on
right.
that.
It's called a Coasian solution.
Right.
And the funny part about it, the hysterically funny part about it, is that no capitalists who claim that they're interested in getting rid of the inefficiency that comes from being forced to use your own labor are interested in the model in which you actually pay people for their securitized rights. Because the real thing they're interested in is not the tiny inefficiency, which is called the Harburger triangle. There's a giant structure below it called the Borjas rectangle, which is what is transferred from labor to capital.
The amazing thing is you've referenced this several times over cocktails in the last 2 years. Yeah.
Well, but my point...
This is
because
cocktail party chatter.
No, but I see
Weinstein family.
I see it differently, Sam. I see your comment that... well, don't we want the best and the brightest? Where you don't reference wage competition. It sounds more like intellectual competition, right? When you open a border and selectively only in certain fields, it's like opening a window in an airplane, and it specifically affects the seat at which it's opened differently than everywhere else in the plane.
Right, right.
So the problem I have with this is that it's a large mimetic complex. And popping back up to the Jeff Epstein issue, the entire university and scientific complex was built on this incredible embedded growth obligation.
Right.
That is the thing that caused the system to have to rescue itself with immigration. So it's really not about immigration or brown people or I don't want to compete against the best and the brightest. The issue was we didn't have enough people to feed into a pyramid system. And what you could do is you could reference a poverty differential between Asia, which was training people acceptably well in technical subjects, but at a lower level. Now that's changed some to fill in the bottom of the pyramid. And so that's really what it was. It was an economic exploit that has nothing to do with the best and the brightest or the color of one's skin. It was just a way of saving a pyramid scheme.
Well, so clearly there's room for innovation on all these fronts, and we should be eager to do it. And we should be certainly eager to find Ponzi schemes that we didn't know were Ponzi schemes, right? Like, I think again, this touches where we started when we were talking about Samantha Power and other in the Southern Poverty Law Center. I think there are systems we set up with the best of intentions and projects and mimetic complexes we launch upon the world with the best of intentions, and we don't see the way incentives will align or the knock-on effects or the externalities of doing those things. And I mean, it's just the world is more complicated than we realize.
Well, and that's like the thing that scares me a little bit. Remember when I said that I have malware in my head?
Yeah.
My belief is that a lot of the beautiful things that you were thinking about being open to the world, training the best and the brightest, keeping some of them for ourselves, distributing some of them back home to grow the pie for everyone, et cetera, that's a mimetic complex that I associate with malware. It's not that there aren't aspects of it which move me.
But I think it's close to the right program. So for instance, if you, like if you say, yeah, it's the fact that I'm not thinking when I say that about the I forget how you put it, but the difference between the local case and the imported case, right?
Right.
You know, I mean, by analogy, you know, opening the window on the airplane, or just the fact that, you know, that you've got people here who are paying taxes to help build out local infrastructure that some titan of industry is going to leverage and globalize, right? And, you know, that money is not coming back to the people who are paying taxes.
So these games, the totality of these games is what got us very angry at the Clinton era people.
Yeah.
Is that the Brad DeLongs and Paul Krugmans and Jagdish Bhagavatis and Bill Clintons of the world, all these people pushed out this idea, and we didn't know how to oppose it. But what they were doing was allowing a slice of our country to continue to grow its slices of the pie.
But again, it's just easy to find the non-nefarious, not malignantly selfish understanding of what happened.
Strange.
I'll give you another example, which I think you're totally familiar with, but will seem less sinister, or at least it seems so to me. So you take what happened to the music industry, right?
Yeah.
So it's like we have a breakthrough in technology. We go from vinyl to CDs, and then I mean those, you know, we suffer those jewel cases for about a decade, and then we get MP3s, which open the door to piracy of a sort no one has anticipated, and then we managed to close down the piracy. We have the iTunes store, and people are, but because of this explosion of piracy, and now the prospect of just, you know, now it's all bits, it's not atoms anymore. We have a fundamental devaluation of the product, right? Like the music, the value of the music has basically gone to zero, right? Because my using a copy of it is not taking it from you.
Because of two things. It's exhaustibility and excludability. So the idea is that if I buy a vinyl record, one, my use of it will eventually wear down the grooves, as we used to do in the old days. And two, my having the record means that you don't have that copy. And that the unit cost is not zero.
Yes, I can't copy your record for free. Yeah.
That is this issue about private goods and services became public goods and services. And even the diehard economists who are free market have to recognize that if something is inexhaustible and inexcludable, price does not equal value. And therefore it cannot command its value. So that was clear to many of us, just as...
But I'm saying there's a non-nefarious account of what happened there, where your iTunes, right, your Apple, you open iTunes for the good of all, right? But you obviously want to make a profit, right? This is a fantastic business. But if you're the musician whose catalog is now worth, you know, 1/10 of what it used to be worth, and now you have this sort of life change foisted on you, where now the only way for you to make ends meet is to tour, but you're, you know, 70 years old, and you felt your touring was behind you, right? All of this looks awful, but again, nobody was thinking about that guy when these changes were
bullshit.
Well,
I totally don't agree with
it's easy
it.
to see that most people weren't thinking. No one had bad intentions toward that guy.
Remember, information just wants to be free and free like beer and all this nonsense. I thought that stuff was just like moronic at the time. Right. Okay. And the same thing with NAFTA, right? The claim,
but again, so what you had in your sights was not. You can't. I don't think you have the wrong theory of mind if you think everyone was aware of what you were aware of and just had the ethical switch flipped in the other direction.
Okay. The economic class teaches public goods in every Econ 101 textbook.
Right.
They also teach trade They have two different names for what happens to improve a society in terms of how it's measured. One called Pareto improvement, which is that everybody in the society is as good or better off. And the other one called Caldor-Hicks, which is some people get hurt, some people get helped. But were you to tax the winners to pay the losers, everyone could be Pareto improved. Yeah. Okay. When you ask these people in real time, why are you talking about a Caldor-Hicks improvement in Pareto terms? So this is the technical, esoteric conversation. Why is your exoteric description of this at odds with your esoteric? Right? This is pure Straussian cryptic bullshit. They say, well, we can't really say that, and we hope that it's not our job. It was this wall of total nonsense. And it wasn't that this wasn't being said in real time. It's that the number of people...
I'm sure you can find the people at the conference who were... I mean, it's, they have one way of speaking to the profession and one way of speaking on the op-ed page of the New York Times.
This is one of the reasons why you and I split on Nassim Taleb. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Nassim during the total nonsense called the Great Moderation in our financial structure before 2008.
Right. And the only reason why I've split on Nassim is that he just wakes up one morning and off his meds and attacks me for reasons I can never fathom. Right? So it's like it's totally personal, or it's intended to be personal. It's not that I take it personally. I mean, I don't even think it's intended to
be personal. But he can correct me on that.
But it's apropos of nothing. Like I've been sleeping when he was sleeping, and then I turn on Twitter and I see that he's attacked me by name for some reason.
When my phone lights up and it says
there's
Nassim,
no intellectual content.
When it says Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he's been my friend for a long time. I literally shake. Like I have to hit right
okay,
answer.
Well, but that's a problem of his personality that he's exporting to the environment.
No,
you're part of the environment.
Look, Nassim is not an inside cat. He just isn't. I see the things he does, and I get a lump in my throat, and I think, am I going to have to defend this? I know what he does, but I think people don't understand him. So at least let me offer up an apology for Nassim Taleb, which he may rip my head off for saying. Nassim is constructed around things that are much larger than what other people are considering. And I'm not saying that he does everything well. I obviously have a totally different tack than he does. So I'm very uncomfortable with his methods, but let's at least say what they are and steelman it to the extent possible. Other people say you, Joe, are misusing statistics. Nassim would say there's a problem with statistics.
Yeah.
And it's constructed to be misused, and it's misused all the time in the same way. And if you do anything that you were normally taught to do in statistics class, if you have a PhD in statistics, you're part of the problem, and I'm going to hold you personally responsible.
Right.
Now, this is very disconcerting to people.
Yeah. I don't think we should spend a lot of time on this, but there are areas where I am not qualified to fact check him. But the areas where I am, where his opinions are just as strident, it's just a deluge of bullshit coming from him. So, like, the stuff he has said about religion and science is not even. I mean, the truth is, it's not even wrong. It's like it's incoherent. It's not like he's got a counterpoint that I still think is wrong, but it has to be argued against.
Look, I've gotten there.
It's just this vomitous.
Look, I've gotten there too. I can't stand the style because it just hurts me. Like I'm very uncomfortable by it. However, there are plenty of times when I thought he was talking nonsense. That, like, at first it sounds like he's making a sensible objection. Then I'm just like convinced he's going off the rails. Right. And then I push further, and it turns out there's even more of a point. So I have learned to be very cautious around him, not because he's the person you want around for most of the time, but when we were in the middle of the Great Moderation and I punked out because I was with him and I was giving talks about Epstein and Madoff. They were the two mysterious functions in New York. Right. And I used to put slides up about Black Arts Capital. It was sort of a play on like Blackstone or BlackRock. And the idea is we'd tell you what we're doing, but we'd have to kill you. Right. We just didn't know. And I got Madoff wrong. I thought he was front running his legitimate business, which turns out was just a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
But I knew Epstein was very likely to be something totally other than he was. Nassim, during this period of time that we were both discussing the nonsense that was the supposed great moderation, was the other guy who would take as much punishment as the community would throw at him. And they would just humiliate him. It's like, oh, he made one lucky trade in 1987. The guy's an idiot. He's a blowhard. He's a fool. And I couldn't take the pressure from giving this talk that obviously we hadn't banished volatility. And I think around 2005, I was about 3 years in, and Nassim says, you're going to regret getting out of this early. You should see it through. And it always stuck with me that I didn't quite have the courage or the strength or the guts or the disagreeability to continue at least to hold the intellectual position. I couldn't time when this thing was going to blow, but it was, I wrote this thing on mortgage-backed securities with Adil Abdulali in 2001. This was nonsense, and it was a world in which almost no one was willing to call it out. And so the singularity in my world about Nassim has to do with he's willing to be one person against billions. He will literally just stand up against any crowd.
Okay, well, so that's often a bug, and you found the one case perhaps where it was a feature. But it's, first of all, we're all like that to some degree. I mean, we're all standing up against a lot. It's very hard for me. Right. And yeah, but
I do it and you do it, but
yeah,
you don't get weak need. I get weak need.
Well, yeah, occasionally, but there is a kind, again, I'm not to psychoanalyze him, but there's a sort of Trumpian level personality problem layered on top of his intellect, where I'm not disputing the guy is smart. There's no question he's smart, but there's so much personality to get through and wrangle with, to interact with whatever smarts are showing up for, depending on the topic. And again, with some topics, I haven't found the smarts, but I'm not disputing that the guy, obviously he's intelligent. It's just, there's no one more enamored of his intelligence than him. Right. And it's like that level of egocentricity. Again, it has a kind of Trumpian, peacock fan quality to it. And in the cases where it's warranted, it's still extra and it's bullshit and it's annoying. When it's unwarranted, it's embarrassing. And he has zero sense of where he is on that landscape.
I hear what you're saying. I do have the sense of the number of floorboards that I can hide under when the stormtroopers come for me are very few and far between that I can count on, and I can count on his.
Okay, but
so we don't need to derange on that.
You're putting a high price on person. I get.
Well, no,
you love about
on
personal loyalty. Yeah.
Well, but Sam, honestly, I find the same thing about you. Where if I'm in a storm, you're one of the tiny number of phone calls I can place, and it's very odd for me that.
Well, I would want you to feel that way. And,
I do.
And
I absolutely do.
So when I call, pick it up and
yeah. Okay, but
you need not shudder at what's coming.
But getting back to this large. So with all of these very dangerous and disturbing topics, I start to understand that you believe, and I think it's correct, that we can often get to hell through a road paved with good intentions.
Yeah,
I don't disagree with that.
And the converse is also true. You can have good effects of bad intentions, and that's and you shouldn't credit the good effects too highly there, right. Because like I think intentions matter for the most part. Intentions are the operating system. So because like if you're iterating on your intentions, if you're error correcting,
right, and
hewing back to the outcomes you actually want, right. Those are the people we can collaborate with, when they're ethical. The people who are right by accident or producing good things by accident are.
But Sam, it's how we encode this that's so interesting to me. Like when we order veal, we just say the word veal. We don't think about what it is that we're causing to occur.
Yes. I want the 3-minute video before I eat the veal. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Like very few of us do that. When I think about like how Debbie Wasserman,
but that's why I don't order veal, right? That's a difference. At a certain point, too much information has a consequence, right? Like I'm not comfortable with veal or foie gras, right?
Yeah.
So it's like and it would matter It should, if you said, well, here's veal, but this is veal, this is pain-free veal,
Right.
This is veal that was, synthesized in a lab, no animals involved. The problem goes away. So that's the fact that you'd want there to be a difference there. You wouldn't, take the most extreme case. You wouldn't want to be the person who would pay more for the veal if you knew there was more suffering associated with it, right? We wouldn't want be the person for whom the suffering is part of the pleasure, right? That's that's clearly a place on the moral landscape you don't want to be, and you don't want to be associated with, right? So if that's at all unsavory, then there are many gradations of better than that, right? So
this gets back to my issue about orcas are either the best or worst species.
Right. Yeah. No, but I didn't mean to derail you there. But it matters. Like we need to unpack the mimetic complex and get at what's inside, and it matters if we fail to. If there's a lot inside and we're unaware of it,
sure,
that matters.
Okay.
How often are we just saying veal without realizing?
For example, I remember when Debbie Wasserman Schultz was being interviewed about superdelegates, and she said they're not superdelegates, they're unpledged delegates, and why do we have to have them? And I think she said something to the effect, and if I'm getting this wrong, I apologize. Something like, well, you wouldn't want the people who aren't regular party workers, just being able to take over the party or something like this. I was thinking like, oh, that's what we all think it is, that it's a primary, and that the people who are registered Democrats should figure out who they should support as a candidate. And her point was, well, we have to have a thumb on the scale, otherwise democracy might happen.
Right. Yeah.
And like that thing is how we encode the badness. We encode it by creating some different way of talking about it.
How we encode it, or we fail to encode it? How it becomes operable, or how?
Well, nobody's a bad person in their own mind most of the time.
Yeah,
So when I do bad things, I encode it differently. So we were just in a situation where we were waiting in a very long line of cars for an off-ramp, and our car, sort of zoomed ahead and then asked somebody's, understanding that we would cut in right towards the exit. Right. So, sort of high-fiving like, geez, we almost got caught in that really long line. Later in the day, somebody cuts in front of us, much less of a problem. It's like, can you believe that guy? And right. So this way in which we sort of see ourselves as the permanent, like, good guy protagonist, in the first case being savvy.
Yeah, but so don't you think living a good life is in large measure a matter of squeezing the delta between those two states of mind?
You think that that's true. And I think
that's why it was a leading question.
I know. Yeah. I know. But I think that it's actually much more tricky.
So let's take the antithesis. What if I told you that I thought it was a matter of getting broadening that gulf, right? So to be more extremely at odds with oneself, depending on what side of the table you're on. In those,
I think you would have been less likely to cut in line. Mm-hmm. But if you did cut in line, I wonder if you'd be less likely to notice it and talk about it the way I do. So I think that your morality and my morality differs slightly.
I don't think you're giving Nassim Taleb too much credit, and you're not giving me enough.
Oh, is that right?
So I am.
I see you as pretty consistent in a lot of ways.
Yeah, what I aspire to be is to cut in line the right amount.
Okay.
And to be appropriately non-judgmental when I see someone else cut in line the right amount.
That's very odd. I'm pretty close to that.
Yeah. I don't have too many illusions about what it is to do it but what it is when somebody else does it. So I'm not as, and when I occasionally catch myself in that mismatch between who I'm capable of being in one moment and how judgmental I am of somebody else in that same mode.
Noticing your own sort of issues makes you a better person if you can port them more generally. So in other words, if you say, look, I recognize that I'm not the best around food or something, but I am very conscious in some other area, like being timely. Well, if you can recognize somebody else's failings as akin to your own in a different area and port that.
Right.
That's a way in which, like, being in touch with your own hypocrisy, I think makes you a better person. And I worry about people who are trying to rid themselves of their hypocrisy rather than first noticing it and then sort of minimizing it so that it's less garish.
But to truly want to minimize it, you have to be in touch with it, right? So that's you run those. Those are two pieces of software you're running at the same time.
Well, I think it's more like I don't see any prospect for ridding myself of it. And other people say, "Oh, I caught some. I have to get rid of it." It's like it's an imagined state that they could. I can prove agree. More or less that you can't live without it.
Because you're not a unitary thing, right? Like
you aren't a unitary thing,
right?
And most of us, even though we know that, we still treat ourselves as unitary things, which is bizarre.
Yeah. Well,
you're in the mindfulness space. So
I work hard not to do that either.
Yeah, but I don't have an app and I don't do these practices, right. But I'm still very conscious of that fact that I'm not unitary.
Yeah. No, I mean that if you follow that a little bit further, that becomes very interesting because you're not. But that doesn't mean there's no norm you want to aspire to follow, right? Like you can be. There are phases of your mind you can prefer to others, and you can. And there's also something that happens when you cease to be taken in by your different selves and all these different modes, right? To the normal degree, then you can then there's a kind of freedom to navigate to a kind of a happier conversation.
But there is some way in which what you're talking about is that one of your parliament of selves is your meta self, which you're probably getting as close to identifying with unitarity as anything else.
Well, it's just the more
thing
the
that
more
supervises
you see
the subroutines, you would probably call Sam Harris.
Well, I would. It's more diaphanous than that. I mean, ultimately, it's just consciousness. I mean, the only thing that can supervise anything or be aware of anything, or experience anything, is what I'm calling consciousness. Now, that's not, when you really pay attention to what that's like, it doesn't actually answer to the name I or me. I mean, it really is it's just this open space in which everything's appearing, including thoughts and intentions and desires and emotions. And there, it really is a cacophony, but the cacophony changes the more you fall back to this position of just witnessing the show, right? And so, it's like I guess, one analogy that's actually fairly apropos is like the difference between dreaming and lucid dreaming, right? The more you lucid dream, the more you actually can kind of change your dreams. I mean, that's what it is.
To a point.
Yeah, but but you're still, there's a consequence to being lucid, and being perpetually lost in thought, being identified, not noticing thought as thought, being identified with every intention that surfaces in the mind, is really deeply analogous to being asleep and dreaming and not knowing you're dreaming. Right? Well, you're in a situation you're not recognizing.
Well, it's interesting because sometimes I can't actually use the information. So, for example, when you went into the "Don't we want the best and brightest" thing, right. I thought, oh my God, Sam is going to drag me there. And that way he's going to be the guy who believes, well, no, because there is no thing called xenophilic restrictionism, which is what most of us are. Certainly I am in my belief structure. And the idea that every single news organ is ready to call any restrictionist a xenophobe. I'm thinking, oh my God, Sam is dragging me to this place. He doesn't even know it. No, and I'm starting to get angry and agitated and excited. And there was nothing I could do to actually, I couldn't find any control knob.
Right. But so I mean, to come back to Earth, where something more concrete than pure consciousness. I'm aware of the potential hypocrisy in judging people. Like, so, like to take, I just kind of shit all over Nassim Taleb, right? I am totally, so I don't believe in free will.
Yeah.
I know he didn't invent himself. Like there's a place in which I'm totally non-judgmental of him. And he can't do otherwise, right? He's just being the perfect version of Nassim Taleb, as is Donald Trump, right? Like that's just, And in Trump's case, the thing that I'm judgmental of, I'm not especially judgmental of him. You know, I mean, he seems like a malfunctioning robot to me, right? He's just, what I'm judgmental of is the larger situation of all of this happening, and half the population seem to be pretending that there's something optimal about it, right? That's like that's so terrifyingly risky to me that I think it's appropriate to be in touch with the outrage module rather than the non-judgmental, nobody created themselves module. And but I pick and choose my moments of outrage, and I get off the ride as soon as there's no longer, as soon as I notice there's no reason to be on
that it's no longer adaptive.
Yeah. So it's like, how much time am I going to, so now, like in my use of social media, like I'll get on Twitter, I'll see something outrageous, I'll get triggered by it, but I mean, I'll get off 30 seconds later and it's over, right? Whereas if I were to do the thing that entangled me, it could take up much more of my life. And so
it's very interesting to me that you've gotten off Twitter as you've become more focused on the meditation and mindfulness part of your offering.
Right. I mean, there's the juxtaposition there may be somewhat accidental, but the vividness, there's a spell that's been broken for me with respect to social media. Like I had paid lip service to this and just didn't know that it was just lip service. But I had been talking about Twitter and social media generally as a psychological experiment that we were running on ourselves, to which no one had consented, right? We just enrolled half of humanity in this thing, and we're just, let's see what happens. And it's clearly having effects that are at best non-optimal, right? At worst, catastrophic. And I was talking about this and thinking in these terms, but still totally embedded in the activity of taking Twitter seriously and feeling that it was a professional necessity. And on some level, it was just sticky enough, emotionally. Like this is, because I'm getting a lot of my news that way. I'm following smart people. I want to see what articles they're reading, and there's an opportunity for conversation. And then somebody like Nassim Taleb says something, outrageously stupid that is, directed
personal
at me, right? And it's going out to hundreds of thousands of people. And so, it's an opportunity for me to tell them to fuck off. And so I find some way to say that. And this thing begins playing out. And to the degree that I've stepped away, which is like 95%, now when I come back and I see, some of my friends, I see you, embroiled with, Claire Lehman or somebody. And it does look like I'm now in touch with the...
Well, you saw that get diffused?
Yeah, no, and I think the skillful diffusal of those conflicts is its own public good that
the thing is I've
try
been,
to maximize. Yeah,
there are people that I can't
that.
diffuse because I don't think they want the thing diffused. Like you went on this person Nice Mango's podcast.
Yeah, that talk about a no good deed going unpunished.
There's just something.
I did my best to launch your podcast.
There's something wrong with that account because there's many ways in which it seems quite reasonable.
Yeah, and then it just degraded into mental illness.
Well, there's a personal nastiness about it that just doesn't let up.
Yeah, and
a lack of charity. And what I find is that there are certain things I can do to slow down that kind of negative experience. And then there are certain diehard actors, some of whom are quite polite and charming and funny, who just will not, like, their thing is they will ride this to the most negative place if they can get there. And that sub-community, I've been talking about in terms of, we have diversity and inclusion, which I'm willing to say is a good thing. And then it needs a different function, which is interoperability and exclusion, because there's certain people who can't be at the table for a conversation if it's going to progress, because their interest is in derailing it. Now, I got into some weird thing just now. Do you know the singer Billy Bragg?
No.
He's like a progressive. He's kind of like a punk Arlo Guthrie or Woody Guthrie, rather.
Yeah.
And like he turns out he wrote a book and he's talking about Eric Weinstein, an investment banker who is a free speech, champion, won't meet with, I don't know, he's got a whole story in his mind. And
so he took a shot at you in his book?
He went on Sam Cedar's program.
Oh, well, there's a venue that is not going to select for
honest
opinions.
I spoke to Sam. Look, there's a problem with the Saul Alinsky thing where Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals.
Rules for Radicals.
The focus on ridicule. I think it's hard to remember, like Country Joe and the Fish was ridiculing a bad war in terms that are ridiculous. You've now got a group of people who, if a mathematician says, that in different arithmetics, you could have an equation like 2 + 3 = 1. And so then you get somebody saying, well, I don't know what they're smoking over there at Princeton, but well, that's ridicule, but you're ridiculing something that you strawmanned and didn't understand.
Right.
Because the person actually was making sense. And so what I see is that the left, and in particular the Sam Cedar crowd, has doing
that with abandon.
Well, it's willing to do two separate things. Sam is quite willing, like there's this whole thing about, will you talk to Sam Cedar? Will you debate Sam Cedar? And my feeling is I would debate part of Sam Cedar, the part that just is focused on the ideas, but the part that is kind of like nasty and ridiculing and doing the Alinsky thing, I don't know what to do with it. I'm not interested. I've spoken to Sam Cedar on the phone. It's perfectly reasonable, made sense to me. We disagreed on positions, but
well, the line that gets crossed for me always with these guys, and again, it's disproportionately on the left, is the line of conscious dishonesty. I mean, it's your brother's aphorism: bad faith changes everything.
Bad faith changes everything.
And I mean, these guys are in bad faith. They know they're lying about, in my case, my views, my actual beliefs, and
not all of them.
There's just too much information.
Well, David Pakman.
No, David Pakman's fine. I just did his podcast.
Yeah, I know. But David Pakman said some pretty non-charitable things in some parts that seemed kind of ridiculing. And
of me?
I think me, other people.
Well, I have never seen him misrepresenting my views. And I think that, I don't know him. I just did his podcast once, but he seems like somebody who, if I said, listen, you got me wrong here, that would matter. And he would make an effort to get me right.
And that's the thing, which is the problem that we have increasingly is that the tactics that are being used in what are called progressive circles have been confused with the content. So that is, the objection to the vehicle, which might be Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, is conflated with the
totally
payload.
Unethical program for smearing people dishonestly.
Well, it's an immoral technology.
Well, no, it's an ends justify the means.
That's the big problem on the left.
Yeah. So, but that ethic is flawed, right? So, for instance, like with me and Trump, like there's nobody who
you don't like the guy
denigrates Trump as avidly as I do, but I am super careful, to be honest, right? So, it's not that anything you can smear him with is fair,
because
right?
You can be, Sam. The problem with
all these guys can be. Sam Cedar can be honest on his show and still have a show. Right. Nobody's going to cancel him because he was too honest.
No, I think that there's like this very weird other. Sam, I don't want to get into the Sam Cedar thing in particular. First of all, because he's going to do an entire show. We know you.
That's right.
No doubt. Sam.
Yeah. But he'll take these quotations and
but he has he has Pakman's ability to reason.
This is the banality of evil, right? Like there's not that many evil people. Right? There's just a lot of people who are functioning in some normal mode with normal incentives. And they become assholes because they're not heroes, right? But so it takes some work not to be an asshole when you're incentivized to be one. And we're all vulnerable to this, but there's some people who have just cashed in to go for it.
That nonsense on the left makes me crazy because in part it just feels like all of my ideals turned into some piece of crap.
We're of the left.
Not only the left, man. I came from a farther left part than I don't even know where you started. But
I've never been tempted to be anything other than a Democrat. I've never even said I'm going to be an independent because, the Democratic Party isn't
certainly,
me.
if I could move to another party that made sense, I'd do it at this point.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that what we don't really understand is that there's a homelessness problem that is really significant. If you are the sort of a person who needs to attach to some kind of institutional structure in a time when there is no institution that actually holds your perspective, you're going to start to do very bizarre things. Now, the thing about you and me is that to some extent, and I don't think we can do this long term, we're okay with being homeless, right? You can sort of first principles, try to think your way out of stuff, but it's very tough for most people. And I think that there are these sort of collection points in the adaptive landscape of politics. Would you disagree with that?
Yeah. Well, one thing that seems important is the connection to science. I mean, we're not spending a lot of time talking about science in this mode, but the dispassion and self-criticism that is the only rubric under which real science can be done bleeds into our thinking about all these other issues. I mean, I think that's got to be a relevant variable. It's like you either have a scientific cast of mind or you don't. And when you don't,
I have both.
Right, but when you don't, you're not seeing the. You're not even seeing intellectual dishonesty for what it is. Right. It's just like motivated reasoning isn't a bad thing. Right. Wishful thinking isn't a bad thing. Confirmation bias isn't a bad thing. These are virtues. This is in religion. This is faith, right? This is
this is like always the issue with our friend Jordan Peterson, which is that when he gets really far out there in the, I don't know, people now call mythopoetic. I don't know the lingo.
Yeah.
You always wonder, are you still maintaining a fact checking ability to bring you back to earth? And so as long as those two facilities are present and in dialogue, and as long as the fact checking, what we call the scientific method is in some sense inadequate to me to explain how science has progressed.
Right.
All the mad thinking and then the spirituality of coming up with breaking new ground doesn't happen.
You just gave us Ramanujan about an hour ago. Yeah. So he's having dreams about the goddess Lakshmi handing him theorems.
Well, there's that, the Carolus school of astronomy that came up with infinite series before Newton and Leibniz was doing it in religious poetry. It rhymed, I think, over there in Kerala. So there is a kind of madness that you have to invite to break new ground, and there's a kind of sanity that you have to invite to wrestle with the madness. And our friend Dan Barkay came up with this idea that science is a two-front war, but that most people have only been deployed to one front. And I think that's a really nice image. I do worry that in part the activist mindset, particularly on the left, has a very clear idea, which is that, it's really a shame the number of people who have to get hurt for justice to be done. Right. And that is a highly conserved idea that I had not understood was broadly distributed.
Yeah, but I mean that is an ethic or a pseudo ethic that we have to just relentlessly criticize, because it's so much harm gets done. I mean that is the thinking that allows good people or otherwise good people to create immense harm. It's like let's throw them off the rooftops because they, the purge is on, and it's sorry we have to break these many eggs to make this omelet. But
partially the question is, how do we spend enough time together to get past this problem? Like, I really think it's quite serious that. Well,
part of it is that we're not actually doing much of this face to face, right? Like, I've never met Nassim, I've never met Sam Cedar, I've never met they shouldn't have been in the same sentence. They have very different problems. But if before any of this had happened, Sam Cedar, I think, has done probably a dozen shows. Or I'm always getting, someone's always sending me a video that he's made that I don't watch, but I log the fact that there's yet another export from his world where he's attacked me. If I had lunch with him before any of this he ever took an interest in me, there might have been a very different
Well,
effect.
that's why I had a phone call with him.
It's the fact we've never, this
is why
anchor to civility. And Nassim is a friend of yours, so you have there's a kind of a loyalty effect, or just a fact, you have a different relationship to his flaws, knowing him as a person. And the same things happen to me, like the fact that I've hung out with Jordan or Ben Shapiro.
Well, you saw what happened with Claire. Let's talk about the Claire situation.
Okay, that would have been different had you never hung out with Claire. Or it might have been different.
No, I think there was a more serious issue, and it just didn't.
To flip it around, it was more of a betrayal, or a seeming betrayal, given the fact that you had hung out together. It wasn't just coming over the transom.
Betrayal in part was my betrayal of Claire. I just didn't know it.
Well, whatever. I'm just saying the dynamics change if you know each other. Right? I'm
trying to make a different point.
Right.
When somebody behaves in a way that is very most unexpected, like what I try to do is I try to slow it down. I say, I bet we're watching two different movies.
Yeah.
And your story and my story the gears are not lining up. And so if we just push on the gears, the teeth are going to pop off and it'll be the end of everything. And so with Claire, what I tried to figure out is, why are you repeatedly sort of coming at me? Do you need to burnish your credentials that you're objective, that you don't have tribalist loyalty? That was one set of issues. But there was another issue, which is this, that Nassim had gone after Claire and I was silent. I didn't want to get involved in it. I didn't like the way Nassim was going about doing what he was doing. Absolutely couldn't take it. Didn't like it. Detested it. On the other hand, I have a particular bug in my bonnet about IQ and race, which is that I think it's an absolutely dangerous topic that's being explored in a really bad way, even by good people.
Right.
And that in part, IQ has this curse that I've said it's a pretty good measure of intelligence. It would be much better if it was obviously terrible or really terrific. But it's in exactly the wrong place, that it does tell us something about intelligence and not nearly enough. So you can be a genius with low IQ.
Right.
That problem, was being teased out, and neither of them, the reason I stayed out of it is just, I didn't believe in Claire's position as I understood it. And I didn't believe in Nassim's tactics as I understood them. And Claire interpreted that, I think, and I don't know this to be true, as, wow, you're seeing me getting mauled.
Right.
And I thought you would be there, or something like that. And so in part, just backing up everything, slowing it down, trying to listen. Ben and I have gotten sideways a few times. To his credit, every time I take something to Ben Shapiro, he'll think better of himself, and he'll come.
Yeah, no, I mean that's my experience as well.
Even though red meat is part of his business.
Yeah. No, that counts for a lot. So the place where we've reached some kind of bad faith singularity,
right,
is where I think, okay, there's we just have to cut our losses. There's no conversation. That's why I would never talk to Sam Seder in a public forum. He's proven himself so committed to the singularity. I mean, it's like there's a bunch. There's maybe 20 people who are just on this part of the landscape where there's no coming back from it. I mean, obviously there's an appropriate, any conversation that would have to happen would have to begin with an actual apology. I'm like, it's just so bad. There's no alternate movie version that's exculpatory, right? These people know they're lying. They're avidly lying. It's all malicious. It's all Saul Alinsky. It's all just smear.
Well, it is Saul Alinsky,
right.
But the best that can be said for it, again, I don't get along with it,
right,
is I believe that they think that they're in desperate times, and they believe that desperate times call for desperate measures. And that's sort of the mindset, which is the ridicule is necessary to stop a greater evil. And that entitlement, as soon as you start experimenting.
But ridicule is not the problem. It's the line that's the problem. It's you can if it's an honest joke
can I be honest?
at somebody's expense.
I've probably watched 45 minutes of Sam Seder total.
Yeah, well, that's more than I've watched, but I've watched enough to know that these are people who, when they're trafficking in audio of my podcast that's been edited to show the opposite of what I was saying, and they get 1,000 blistering comments telling them about this, they keep the audio up, or they don't.
Well,
they never correct an error.
I agree,
right?
but that's what's coming out of it.
That's psychopathic behavior. It's like
so
whether or not they're psychopaths, they're acting like
all right.
psychopaths.
But then we've got a giant chunk of our world, and in part a lot of the sense making apparatus that is explicitly amongst itself psychopathic. It believes that it is under threat in desperate times, and desperate times call for desperate measures. This is its opportunity, and it's going to do things. And it's going to be the thing that I didn't understand about it, because I came from the left, is that it just explicitly thinks in, that's too bad.
Right.
I'll get you a Kleenex next. It's just this dead cold-heartedness that progress requires that good people get hurt. Boo-hoo. And that thing is so hardcore.
That's going to make that makes the Trumpian backlash understandable.
And that's really in part what I'm trying to get at, which is that when I went to Washington in like 1996 on immigration issues, I went into some staffers, like some warren of cubicles, and I saw this sign on one of the cubicles that said, if it's worth fighting for, it's worth fighting dirty for.
Right.
And I came to understand that if you wanted to survive and thrive and get stuff done in Washington, that had been absorbed almost universally.
Right.
And then once I realized that, I had to make a decision. Did I really want to get good things done, or did I want to stay a person I could live with? And that's very painful to actually have to think about.
Yeah, but I think that is an easy choice, or should be. We want to create a world where that's an easy choice. Right?
We want to create a world in which that's an easy choice. What we have created is a system of selective pressures, which may actually end up selecting for that over and over again. And you don't realize, and this is the issue. The reason that so many of these things make me angry, like the Great Moderation, or the abuse of the immigration system to decrease wages, and then you cry xenophobia when somebody points it out, or NAFTA, and large areas of the country get really hurt, and you're saying that everybody's going to be made better off, is that all of these things I can see in real time. Like right now, what I can see, like those things of the past, is I can see this weird, and this is getting back to the Jeff Epstein thing. There is a deliberate attempt not to talk about the intelligence community and its links to Jeffrey Epstein. And it is clear, and it's a very short proof, because assume that he had no links to the intelligence community, like none whatsoever. Somehow a member of the Trilateral Commission, affiliated with Rockefeller University, Harvard, no links to any intelligence community anywhere in the world. You could sell papers debunking the claims that people want to know, which is, how is this guy tied in with the intelligence community? Right?
So you're saying it's fishy that no one's doing that?
Well, I mean, it's beyond fishy. In other words, you have something that everybody's demanding and wants. If it weren't true, you could get paid by showing that it's not true, or making the best argument possible, or making fun of how thin the claims are.
Well, that may yet happen. I mean, I don't know that somebody isn't writing the 5,000 word Atlantic article on Epstein that's going to answer.
Dude, how long has it been? This guy supposedly commits suicide. We don't know whether, what branch of the decision tree that's on. And you can search, go to the New York Times and search on intelligence. The thing and Epstein, like, it's not being explored. It's not being shut down. It's like anechoic tile in your echolocating. It's not what you're hearing. Go to the search bar and search for things that people are discussing that don't come up. And that's what's telling you that there's something this guy was apparently a serious sexual predator. We're in an era of Me Too.
Right. But there are anomalies like that. I mean, the clear anomaly for me was, and it's one for which I don't have any sinister explanation. I just think it's an anomaly of the news cycle we're in.
Right.
It's sort of what Trump has done to our information diet. When the Las Vegas shooting, perpetrated by a man whose name I don't even know, right? And I'm kind of a student of these things, but I never even took the time to learn the guy's name. I think many press reports decided to not use his name. No, but this was the biggest shooting in American history.
Right.
Right. And 48 hours later, nobody was talking about it.
Well,
Now,
that's not true.
Yeah, that's like it had fallen out of the news cycle
Very
and
bizarre.
never came back in.
It vanished
Right.
very quickly.
But
there you,
I don't think there's any reason why it vanished apart from the fact that we just don't have the bandwidth for it anymore. It's like there was no link that made it clearly ideological. I mean, nothing surfaced. He wasn't a clear white supremacist or he wasn't a jihadist. I mean, there was no.
you remember the word bump stock?
Yeah. So the bump stock.
Okay, so why weren't we talking about bump stock?
Yeah, so we banned bump stocks as a result of that thing, and that's the legacy of that atrocity. But if you had told me at any point beforehand that on whatever day of the week it was, you're going to have the biggest mass shooting in American history by far, and it was going to be a fairly cinematic one, right? I mean, it's like you're talking about shooting out from the windows of a.
Did you see Dan Bilzerian was at this thing?
Oh no! I think
Dan Bilzerian is running out of this thing, saying like, "We're under fire. I'm going to go get my gun," and he's doing it in real time.
If you told me we're not going to be talking about this a week later, right? That just wouldn't compute. But that is the situation we're in. I mean, somehow it just didn't survive the Darwinian contest with whatever else was on social media.
I don't really think that that's what happens.
Well, so then why aren't we talking about it?
Well, that's see, look, and you're starting to smile. Yeah. No, this is the thing that conspiracy theorists get dead wrong, which is you are allowed to notice some very weird anomaly and not have to say what it is you're noticing. Right? So my claim, like,
but you don't buy my explanation, which is because there was not an immediate purchase on a larger story of motive, and this guy, it was just not a lot of information came out about this guy that was salient. It just we're so deluged by other stuff, most of it Trumpian.
Correct. You're not correct in my opinion.
Okay.
So let me
that's interesting. So
so the way I would say it,
but whoever's right or wrong, I'm just saying that this belief that I now have. That we have a different relationship to information now. In recent years.
Agree that we're cycling through things very quickly, but that was a spectacular. There's a reason we're talking about.
It was amazing, yeah,
because it's anomalously weird how fast that story disappeared.
Oh yeah.
Now, one of the things that we have to talk about in that realm is Dana Boyd and her discussion of strategic silence. So that's your search string people playing along at home. Strategic silence is a doctrine of some kind that says that news media should not report the news because of its potential impact.
And where was this articulated?
You should check out Data and Society, which is a particularly interesting organization which fingered our friends as the alternative influencer network.
Oh, right.
And Dana Boyd, who I believe is sort of in our circles, in the tech circles, starts talking about the need for strategic silence.
A girl Dana or a boy Dana?
A female.
Okay.
Somebody I perceive to be female.
Yeah, I don't.
Dana. I now don't want to touch.
Yeah. Okay.
A human named Dana Boyd.
Right.
And strategic silence. And she also talks about data gaps, if I'm not mistaken, if I have my terminology right. And so then you have to look at things like style guides, like the AP style guide or the New York Times style guide, which is the way in which people are directed to report news stories. Is there a danger of copycat killings? So there may be a body of thought around what does one do around mass shootings so that we don't have future mass shootings? Yeah. Or if this is particularly exciting to certain people, should we publish the manifesto? So as you start to understand what the meta rules around these things are, some of those could be innocent.
Well, I think some are better than innocent. I think some are benign, and we've been slow to adopt them. I think the fact that I don't know this guy's name is probably a good thing for the world, and that was part of the new style guide. You just don't.
Did you read the New Zealand shooters manifesto?
No, but I part of it. But yeah, I haven't read.
Okay.
The whole thing. No.
So that.
But
what I don't want is somebody saying we should not read we should criminalize reading the New Zealand Shooters Manifesto. But by the way, let me tell you, he told us all that Candace Owens was his inspiration.
Right.
Because that's not what the shooter did. So now
Well, no one wants to criminalize it. I'm just saying that you.
No. I'm saying something much more disturbing.
It's appropriate for journalists to worry that merely shining a light, pointing a camera at this new atrocity is should be the default setting, right? Like, name the guy. Let's go get into his story. Let's find out why he did it, and do all of this in public.
We're in such a much more dangerous place, in my opinion. But
maybe we're talking past each other here. It's just that we've been very slow to realize that the part of the mimetic contagion here is the copycat effect. The fact that people, in their own perverse way, these people are being martyred and lionized just by the mere sharing of this information about them.
Let's agree that in a better world, we would have a situation by which we would not want to communicate
we want to make these people famous.
We don't.
Fame is part of the motive, right? Posthumous fame even is part of the motive. So, and it's part. Even if it's not part of the motive, it's part of what is attractive to the living, aspiring gunman.
Well, so right? First of all, let me steel man your position to make sure I'm getting it, and then I can take issue with you, and we'll see whether I'm adding or subtracting.
Right.
I think what you're saying is that because of the information quality and the fame quality and the inspirational quality to copycat killers, that communicating the information that somebody wished to communicate, provided they're willing to make a down payment in terms of dead bodies taken, lives taken out of this world.
I'm not even focused on the manifesto. I'm focused on just naming the person.
Okay. You're sympathetic at some level with the concept of strategic silence.
Yeah.
I would be sympathetic with the concept of strategic silence if I trusted the people who are supposed to manage it. But I'm trying to get to the next layer,
right.
which
I understand that concern. Yeah.
I am very concerned that the people who are enthusiastic about strategic silence are interested in telling us partial information about all of these things so that we cannot actually tell what the hell just happened.
Well, yeah. So you just changed the topic to jihadism, and we're perfectly in agreement because, yes, they will elide the religious identity of perpetrators in various contexts and actually hide information from us, right? So they'll
correct.
You'll see something happen. The media will pretend it's inexplicable, right? Like the Orlando shooting. It's like maybe this guy was it was his repressed homosexuality that was the problem, right? And yet those who have a little bit of information recognize that this is a clear-cut case of jihadism and indoctrination and a spread of and the consequences of certain ideas. And the analogous situation on the other side would be, what if we were going to systematically conceal evidence of white supremacy being the motive for a certain
right, but what
attack,
I'm trying to say is that in all of these killings, like you just pointed out that the Unabomber, you reread the Unabomber's manifesto.
Right.
Now, the Unabomber wrote a story called Ship of Fools, which I thought was relatively interesting, about people losing their heads in social justice and society getting
There's some of that in the manifesto too.
Yep.
I mean, he's very critical of
he's
not
the left. Not a dumb man.
Yeah.
That Kaczynski guy.
Yeah.
However, the point was that you were able to mine that for information, and then you were able to reach some pretty interesting conclusions about where Kaczynski was relative to society in general. You trusted yourself.
Right.
Okay. My guess is that when it comes to jihadis, you are more interested in communicating the information about what the motivational structure is because it is prescriptive that something might be done. However, it is also
actually there's another reason. It's not just that it's prescriptive. It may not be. It's just that there's more contact between.
There are more levers to play with to try to control the situation.
And it's a much larger problem.
No kidding. Yeah. Right. But on the other hand, if I look at the New Zealand shooters and the Squirrel Hill shooters manifestos,
right,
it's disgusting and it has content.
Yeah.
And, the way on which I can explain to people how all of the open border type stuff is going to cause future problems is just to say, you may not think of a country the way I do or somebody else, but imagine that somebody comes to your home as a guest, and you give them the key, and they say, I hope you don't mind, but I noticed that there were a lot of people on Skid Row today who didn't have anything to eat, no place to sleep. So I ran off 2,000 copies of your key, and I hope we can adopt all those people when they come over later tonight, because I gave them the address and the security code. Now, if that starts to rattle around in your brain, you don't feel good about it. You may not conceive of your country as a house with a front door and a security code and rules as to who gets in and out, but they do. And some of those people are going to go crazy, and they're going to kill people. And I know that to be the case. And it's not that I'm sympathetic with a synagogue shooter or a mosque killer. Fuck those guys. The point is that we are not trying to get the information because we have this class of people, this intermediating class that I don't trust as far as I can throw them, and that you still have more residual trust in. In other words, my feeling about data in society is that I understand all sorts of things that they're trying to do, but they're super dangerous. They are incredibly dangerous, in part because they're going to be backed by people like Bill and Melinda Gates. Or the Ford Foundation, or whatever it is.
This is the Southern Poverty Law Center problem.
Exactly.
And other guys. So it's, I think you and I have been talking past each other a little bit here.
All right.
I totally agree that in this case, we can't really trust the gatekeepers. The only thing that I was expressing open-mindedness about, or agreement about, with respect to strategic silence, is there is this,
I would trust you to do strategic silence, Sam.
Well, in some ways, it's impossible. It's like take it out of the
because
atrocity.
you know that.
Yeah, but there's the atrocity side of it, which is its own thing. But just take the case of famous suicides, right? We know that suicide is contagious, right? And there's, this has a name, the Werther effect, based on Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. So there's the fact that a sufficiently prominent person who's got any kind of, especially, and this is true, I think, for any suicide, but especially if there's some sort of Byronic, romantic gloss that can be put on it, suicides go up, and suicides go up in ways that are, horrific. But plane crashes go up. Right. And we believe, I don't know if the data has changed on this, but as of, 20 years ago or whenever this was done, I think this was in, might have been in Cialdini's book, Influence. Plane crashes go up, and the interpretation of that is that some number of airline pilots commit suicide with everyone on board. Right. We know that's happened before. There's one famous case of that, but it just out of the statistics, that seems to be suggested. But so, what do you do when Anthony Bourdain commits suicide? How do you cover that story? There has to be some style guide around how you cover it, and it's not. And at one point, it could look like an unwillingness to actually get at the truth, but what's actually motivating you is not an unwillingness to get at the truth. It's just you're aware of the potential contagion effect here, depending on what the actual story is.
So I can't figure out where our energy differs. I agree with you that in theory, strategic silence, don't publicize things where the benefit is very slight,
right,
and the cost is enormous. I get it. But right now, we're in some different place, which is that a lot of us, just don't trust any of the gatekeepers. There's not one gatekeeper that I want making that decision for me at the moment. And, in particular, it's very weird that I get the concept, Dana, but I don't trust you because you came out with this alternative influencer network thing, which had zero methodology on it. So you're volunteering.
And it's all guilt by association. And it's,
and Noam Chomsky talks to Stefan Molyneux and he's not included, but it's total nonsense. And the person who wrote it has been revealing herself as a complete activist rather than a researcher.
Right.
So there's total breakdown on that thing. What I'm confused by is the more of this kind of shielding that we have, the more likely we're going to have 4 more years of Donald Trump. And I can only imagine what's going to happen after
Right.
An 8-year Trump presidency? Are we going to move to the next level of really unexpected candidate?
Yeah.
We have got to realize that we're making
Now for the most shocking rose ceremony ever.
We've got to realize that what we're doing is we're making people crazy because they can see that it's the Truman Show.
Yeah.
And so if we had a discussion where had you heard strategic silence before?
I think
from me, I know.
Yeah, I think I'd heard the phrase, but
we're not having a national discussion and coming to a national consensus about this, or we're going to use strategic silence when it's jihadi violence,
right,
and we're not going to use it
when it's white supremacist violence.
Yeah, in a different way. We're going to leak particular information, provided it goes this way and not that way. That's what's going to cause an infinite series of Trumps.
Yeah, well, yeah, and more importantly for this topic, I think it's imperative that we understand what is actually going on and why people are doing what they're doing, and what the scale of the relative risks are. And I mean, just how big a problem is, I mean, my last podcast, which I haven't released yet, is on this topic, just talking to someone who's written a history of white supremacy and white power in the U.S. And I'm just trying to get a handle on how big a problem it is. And I came away from that podcast convinced more or less that nobody knows how big a problem it is, right? So, but there's a in this particular space, there's the possibility of conflating the new memetics of 4chan and 8chan, where you have incel teenagers trafficking in Holocaust imagery and lynching photos,
exactly,
right, just to get a rise out of the normies, right, where it's not actually the ideological software program that we're worried about when we're worried about the KKK and neo-Nazis and their sincere attempt to
there's that, and there's
create
also
a coup in the U.S., right?
I agree with that. And then we also have this very different situation in which we have a problem on the left where I don't think that the left is as yet has the same propensity for violence that the KKK style white supremacists had.
Right.
But it's been totally normalized, this far left woke destruction of the basic ability to think inside of the sense-making organs. Whereas there's no normalization of Stormfront,
right?
And people are going to try to say that the president, is the normalization of that. And I agree there are a lot of problems with the presidency, but I don't think that that's Stormfront.
Exactly.
And so, in that picture, I think what I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion of surrounds the idea that we're trying to have very low resolution conversations, which is what the baby boomers and the traditional media taught us to do. We have these very small sound bites. And do you think the left is worse than the right? Are you kidding me? Well, there's no way to square that because it's multivariate and it depends which way you compressed worse or better to say which thing actually,
right.
Do you talking about potential energy or are you talking about realized energy?
Yeah. And also there's just, the fringe is not the same thickness on the far left and the far right. Like the far left fringe has much more of an effect on the mainstream than the far right fringe does. I mean, the far left fringe has affected how the New York Times does its thing and how tech does its thing,
right.
You don't have if we had members of the KKK determining what gets published on the opinion page of the New York Times, right? That would be the analogous problem, right? And that's
we don't see it.
We don't see it.
No, and we can't discuss it, in my opinion, because of the key thing that we were supposed to do with long form stuff is to raise the level of resolution possible in the discussion. We didn't push out enough terminology, enough sort of new patterns of thinking, and that's the work left to be done. So this is like sort of a personal question, and it has to do with the fact that I know you've reviewed some of the episodes of the show that you've been partially responsible for helping birth. Do you have any feedback for me as to what's worked, what hasn't? I can sort of talk to you a little bit about where I'm thinking about taking the show. And are you happy with it, or what would you like to see from the portal? I don't think I've asked this from anybody else.
Yeah, no, I'm incredibly happy you're doing it. I think you're the right man for the job. So you should be
honored that you'd say that.
You should be. I'm just, it's about time, right? Like I've been nudging you.
You have been nudging, but like it's a little bit intimidating to, for some reason I broke into this sort of top echelon of people with enormous audiences and really professional content. So it's,
but what I think you're doing is novel in that, you only have so much control over what you get because the other person has to show up, and you're not quite sure in many cases what they're going to bring. But like in your case, you had a conversation with David Wolpe, right, who I've debated several times, both in public and in private, and you had a great conversation with him, right? So like you had a much better conversation with him than I've ever had with him.
That's not fair.
Well, it is fair.
No, it's no, it's not fair because that conversation wouldn't have happened if I hadn't observed your conversations with him. And I sort of watched.
But I've observed my conversations with him, and I guarantee you the next conversation I have with him will still be worse than the conversation you had with him, right? Because I'm going to feel like I need to fight certain battles, right? Like I'm not going to let him get away with certain things which you are right to let him get away with. One, because you honestly feel like you don't occupy precisely my position with respect to those points. So you're not being dishonest. You just see it differently. But two, you also are trying to have a different conversation. You're not trying to pressure test all of his ideas, about God whenever they surface. You, although you did go in that direction a little bit, you were actually trying to have a conversation about the richness of Judaism without coming in with my agenda, which is clearly we have to get past this parochial balkanization of humanity based on these Iron Age philosophies, right? We have to find some new, modern, non-sectarian equivalent to everything we think we care about in religion. That's not your game, and because it's not your game, you had a much better experience of David Wolpe than I get. So that's and
it was a conjecture that there was more there.
Yeah,
in part born out. Well, it was born from watching you guys interact and figuring that, in fact, I don't think David was particularly attached to the rigid interpretation of the text in a literal sense, nor even to the concept of an anthropomorphic deity.
Oh yeah, I know he's not. And I mean, the first time I debated him, maybe it was the second time with Hitch. In the middle of one of those debates, I was sort of blindsided by his lack of commitment to a personal deity, because I said something that presupposed that he believed in a God that could hear our prayers.
I see.
And he said,
why would you believe that?
What makes you think I believe in a God who can hear prayers, right? And he's a conservative rabbi, so this was a surprise to me. But anyway, I've changed my view of what to expect there as a result of that. But still, there are things he would say that would get me bogged down in the way that I got bogged down with Jordan Peterson in our first podcast, with a debate, a 2-hour conversation about the nature of truth, right? So with Jordan, I had to decide, okay, because we've just put a bunch of live events on the calendar, and we need to find a way to have an enjoyable conversation, in addition to disagreeing where we're going to disagree. There has to be a different geometry to it here. It just can't always just dive straight to into the true basin of attraction, which is, let's figure out exactly what you mean, because I smell something fishy, right? So, so I thought it was great, your conversation with David, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, so like I learned stuff from him that I wouldn't learn had I been having the conversation, because I would have had
I can't tell you how much that means to me. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think what you're doing here is bound to be super unique, because you're, you're a real polymath doing this, and there are not a lot of people who are doing podcasts with the same kind of wealth of information you have on so many fronts. So
I'm flattered, and I really appreciate what you're saying. The odd thing is that it's not really supposed to be an interview show.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done a bunch of interviews in part Joe Rogan said something to me early on. He said, look at my earliest podcast. He's like, stop worrying about whether it's perfect. I was just clowning around with my friends with a webcam. And I went back to the original Joe Rogan experiences, and he's not kidding.
I haven't done that. Yeah, I haven't
you'll
seen
enjoy
the other
it.
ones, yeah.
The problem is that people are really angry about everything that happens as I'm beginning. It's like, why is the glass on the edge of the table, and the plosives are too loud, and there's like a lot of stuff that is there is no introductory period, because weirdly this thing was discussed on the Rogan program, and so it debuted on Apple because of their ridiculous algorithm at number one.
800,000 podcasts, and you were number one.
Exactly, which I've never been remotely close to since. And even though the podcast has grown in listenership, so partially what's happening is that we're just trying to find a format and to get comfortable with the idea. But a lot of what it's supposed to do is to go into intellectual territory that isn't based on an interview with a guest, to see whether or not we can bring an enormous number of people closer to the most transcendent, solid intellectual achievement that is on offer. Because in general, it feels to me like there's this monastery where all the good stuff is kept, and almost nobody ever visits or reads any of it.
Right.
And
so you're speaking specifically of your wheelhouse of physics? No. Or just anything that interests you, that
biology, music.
Okay.
But language.
But just to make sure that I understand what you're saying that you're envisioning many podcasts being just you and a whiteboard or something where you're
some kind of graphics.
Right.
I think graphics are going to be important.
Right.
I think they're going to be some difficult topics that are going to be pretty heavy going intellectually, that I'm going to try to make as easy as I can. But to partially leverage the fact that, and this is kind of a theme running below the surface, which occasionally like magma comes up through the crust, because it was so difficult for me to understand anything that was going on in my junior high school and high school years because of symbolic issues and learning style differences. A lot of what happened was that I was able to put things together out of sheer necessity without going through the symbolic channel. And it's my belief that even if people don't see themselves like, let's say, learning disabled, that the symbolic channel is where we get stuck. That most people, if you show them a page of equations, they tune out.
Right.
And it's very difficult to figure, well, what can you communicate that isn't an analogy, but that actually gets people to an understanding of sort of just the majesty of human intellectual achievement. And so the hope is going to be that if we can get some decent production values and get the ad models to work, that we can start experimenting with some sort of hybrid graphical and discussion and solo.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
And I think you should explore. It'd be fascinating for you to explore the alternative learning paradigm, learning disability question. I mean, people would find that incredibly useful and inspiring if there was something there to explore that would be, especially if it would be actionable on the basis of
the thing
for parents or
so many of us
teenagers,
Like I can't tell you how much hopelessness I produced in my parents because no matter what I tried to do, nothing worked. And I know that experience of a bright, interested kid who just can't buy a base hit in school is duplicated in probably 15-20% of the households in America. It's like an enormous unknown population. What my hope is to show people why the sort of learning disabled or dyslexic mind might have superpowers.
Do you actually have a diagnosis of dyslexia?
I've been dyslexia, dysgraphia, something called kinesthetic reinforcement. People have.
Did you get these as a teenager, or is it something?
Things were in their infancy back then. There were batteries of tests that are different. Like there was this Kurdish word test when they assumed nobody knew Kurdish. I didn't know Kurdish for sure, and they tested to see whether you could remember a bunch of words you'd probably never seen. And in one list, you wrote them out, and in one list, you didn't, to aid in the memory. And so when I got back a test, this was at Harvard, I was like very high 90s in lots of different areas. And then in one area, my score plummeted to like 3rd percentile.
Right.
I said, what is that? And somebody said, well, that's kinesthetic reinforcement. I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, were you to take notes, you would erase everything that you're learning.
Right. Right.
And I said, what did you just say? And I realized that my note taking had wiped out my entire education up to that point.
Well, now, why would you have taken a test like this at Harvard?
I was struggling. I was in the most symbolically dependent subject. I mean, at some point I'll get into my history in mathematics, but there was no one remotely like me in my situation as a PhD student at Harvard. And it was the worst possible ostensible mismatch you could imagine, because math lives in symbols. It isn't symbols, but the symbols are really crucial for understanding what's going on. And that's exactly where I'm blocked. And the hope that I have is if I can get around symbols in large measure for myself, can I do it for people who aren't even necessarily blocked on learning channels?
I would love that, because I consider myself more or less, by comparison, innumerate, because I took math, in high school. It's not that I was sort of equivalently good on both sides, both humanities and math. I mean, it was not obvious that I shouldn't be pursuing math, but I never, once I did calculus in high school, I just never got math. Like I never got it was just work, and I never really got it. And then I've just taken mathematical logic and statistics at the college level, but like my math education stopped at a point because I hit a wall of one, just lack of exposure to the beauty of it. I mean, I'm like a fan of math now, in terms of its broad concepts, but I hit the burden of having to to learn the language of the symbolism was high enough that
it's crippling.
There was not enough reason to struggle with it, and I just
this is why learning disabilities, if you can overcome them, end up in part as this incredible superpower. Because, and I talk about this in terms of color blindness. So both my brother and I are colorblind in a standard way, but we make the point about contrast blindness, because there's a trade-off between whether you see color better than others or worse, or whether you see contrast better. So to the extent that what you see as learning disabilities is mysterious to you, like why would this be retained in such a large portion of the population? Right. It's because I think it has the characteristic of being the cost that is paying for another superpower relative to somebody who's not blocked on those channels. And like, for example, I don't know whether you noticed the objects that are around here.
The Klein bottles, I saw that. But
yeah.
I haven't.
So, for example, that's Bathsheba Grossman's art, and that's a 24 cell, which is the unique new analog of a Platonic solid that is not found. The convex polytopes are the analogs of the Platonic solids in dimension 4. This is pushed back into dimension 3, and that's the unique convex polytope that has no analog directly in dimension 3. So then the other one that you have there is the analog of the
So what do you mean? This is a three-dimensional projection of a four-dimensional object? Okay.
So like, if you've seen the tesseract, that is the hypercube, which is the three-dimensional model that represents a four-dimensional structure.
Right.
This right here is pretty directly the analog of the dodecahedron in 4 dimensions projected back into 3 dimensions.
Now, and again, this is my topology is a layman's topology, but are some projections back into 3 dimensions far more evocative of the 4-dimensional object?
Yeah, you'd want to see a lot of them so that you could understand.
Right. So how do you have an internal sense of how much you understand or don't understand the higher dimensionality of an object based on its 3-dimensional
for example,
characterization?
if we took a regular Klein bottle here,
Right.
and for those of you at home, I guess we should be talking about what we're doing on video.
Yeah, right.
So I have a glass bottle where the neck has been passed through to what would be called the punt. And in 3 dimensions, it appears to intersect the side of the bottle. But if you had an extra dimension represented by the amount of blueness in the bottle, and we colored this blue in the bell clear here, you could see literally in 4 dimensions, this doesn't intersect itself because this part of the glass would be clear and that part of the glass would be blue. Hence, they're separated by some dimension that we can't represent spatially.
Right.
So by mixing spatial dimensions with color dimensions, I claim you can actually see in 4 dimensions that this thing doesn't run into itself. The Klein bottle appears to intersect. And mathematically,
Does that have the same logic as a Mobius strip? Is it just
2 Mobius bands sewn together,
okay?
right? Now, the point that I was making is that is an example of an object where you don't realize you can see 4 dimensions by just adding a color dimension to spatial dimensions.
Right.
So I can give you lots of intuition pumps and this is what I did on the Rogan program with the hop vibration. I called it the most important object in the universe, not because the hop vibration is, but it's the only example of a principal fiber bundle, which is the underpinning of really the most fundamental physics we have. And my intention is to read 1 paragraph of Ed Witten with my audience. So, Oprah has a book club or had a book club.
Right.
So I'm going to just try to get through 1 paragraph, which I think is the most important paragraph ever written in the English language, not because Ed Witten's prose is so beautiful, not because it's free of error, but because it actually makes an attempt to say what our most deep notions of reality are in a single paragraph with relatively few symbols and unknown words. So maybe to do a paragraph club where other people do a book club. And so
that'd be awesome.
The hope is to really start off with conversations. But if people are following along at home and they say, "Where's the portal?" We're just getting started. These are the opening shots.
Yeah. But I would encourage you even as a side gig to the portal, maybe this is not podcast material, maybe this is an online course or something, but to find a route in to higher mathematics for the symbol blocked.
But I want to do music. Yeah. I want to do the unity of knowledge, all the stuff that people don't even know is out there to be found, because I believe that, I call this transcendence hacking, that the feeling of transcendence that often induces religious feelings is really better purposed as a guide to what is worth paying special notice towards in a world drowning in distraction. And that feeling of, oh my God, like this thing here, I don't know if you've seen this.
No.
I'm pointing at a crystal cube. That is a 3-dimensional projection of an 8-dimensional root system of the 248-dimensional exceptional E group E8. So this is sort of the most complicated exceptional object known.
Is this your nemesis's favorite
He doesn't
object?
own it. In fact, I was on it before he was.
Okay.
I abandoned
What's his name? Garrett
Lisi.
Yeah.
Yeah. But everyone should know that it's there and worry about it, whether they're a professional mathematician or not. So the idea, I wasn't planning to talk about the objects, is to leave Easter eggs and clues all over the place so that people start to habituate themselves to the idea that you don't need angels or magic texts in order to commune with something that gives you the feeling that maybe we're not totally alone. And that doesn't have to be an animate thing that one worships. It can be just the wonder of, my God, there's so much more mystery than anyone knew was here even a short time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, keep going. I'm enjoying the ride.
All right. Well, Sam, thanks very much for coming by. You're welcome to come back anytime. Awesome. And thanks for helping launch us all those years ago with the first podcast we did over at your studio.
Nice.
So you've been through the portal with Sam Harris. Please subscribe to us on Apple, iTunes, or Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. And please check us out on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell if you want to be notified for future episodes. Thanks for hanging in there. Be well.